To invite people on who are doing work in order to present their projects. And the hope is that they'll find people who are interested in the same things, and in that way we can build some collaboration to, bring the community up. The space relies fairly heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where links to individual tweets are posted. The reason we use the nest so much is I try to provide sources for everything that I present. In that way, you don't have to take my word for things. And also, if a subject interests you, then you have a starting point to take away for more reading. If you were to scroll to the far right-hand side of the nest, you'll see that it's the invite to tonight's space. If you were to click on that, down in the thread, there is the agenda, which is our speaking notes, and that's where you'll find the links to the tweets that I'll be putting up in the nest as we go along through the discussion. So that's where all the sourcing comes from. If you follow me, apologies for the way that the thread was posted in a broken way today, so I had to try posting it several times. So if you got a bunch of notifications, I'm sorry about that. I think I figured out what the issue was. It's I signed up for Twitter Blue 2 weeks ago, and I think it's one of the features built in there that was causing problems. So tonight, we are going to run through some resources for probably about 15 minutes. As usual, I do that both to let the room warm up, let people assemble. I like covering the resources up front so that, the folks who are dedicated and interested in learning about tools can come right on time and hear about that. And then after we run through resources, we will move on. Tonight, Exit, who is a regular co-host of mine, is going to give us an update on the Black Sea, the developments in the Black Sea, and particularly the export of grain. I won't say exactly the Black Sea Grain Initiative because that looks like it has wound down, but there are still lots of angles and storylines that may be important that we'd like to follow. And so we're going to speak with Exit about that for a while. We'll do a recap on the events around the Kirsch Bridge, and then we'll just go into general updates on the offensive and equipment and so on. So I'm going to begin on the far right-hand side of the nest. That first tweet on the right-hand side, again, is our the invitation to tonight's conversation with the agenda in the thread. The second item from the right is the invitation for our next discussion, which will be Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. I try to hold these spaces every Thursday night at 9 and every Sunday at 4 Eastern time. If you have a look, the third item from the right is our community calendar. We put this together so that we could coordinate hosting between different spaces. So if you have a look on there, there are some other good Twitter spaces, either on the war in Ukraine or on OSINT. Since we had the calendar, we decided that we would add outside events to it as well. Most of them are from universities and think tanks. If you were to click the link, it will open up the calendar in your browser, and then individual calendar entries will have a link either to a registration for an upcoming event or usually to a recording of an event that's already passed. If you were to look in that tweet, again, it's the third from the right, titled calendar and events, you'll see that I've highlighted 4 upcoming events. One is being put together by, I believe it's Chatham House, who is holding a talk on July 25th. So is that, what is that, next Tuesday, I think? Hopefully I've done the math right. And their conversation is on the dangers of a premature peace plan in the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is a subject we've talked about in our space before. There is also an event. It's really out there date-wise. It's not until November, but it catches my attention as a lawyer. It's on the new frontiers of open source evidence, and it's actually being held by one of the inns of law in the United Kingdom. And part of the reason I just saw the invite the other day, part of the reason I put it up so early is some of you may be based in the UK, and you could theoretically attend in person. And there will be presentations from the folks at Bellingcat about their work, particularly on maintaining digital evidence. And they have a very interesting history we've discussed before about working to get various forms of digital evidence, chains of custody and so on, into various courts. There is also a hearing that's going to be held by the Helsinki Commission, which is a U.S. congressional commission for cooperation with European allies. And this particular hearing will be on July 26th, and it's about rescuing Ukrainian children and women from Russian aggression. And so we've had lots of discussions in our spaces about the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. And I believe, so they'll essentially be taking testimony, including from several Ukrainian authorities, such as the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Mykola Kuleba. Finally, in the events, just a reminder that there are various OSINT events that are going to be held at DEF CON, which is, one of the premier cyber convention. And so there's an invite to one of them here. I don't know very much about this particular event, but I'm using it as an example of some of the OSINT focused events that are held at DEF CON. So if you're going to that convention, check that out. If you actually attend any of those or you are involved in their organizing, then do let us know. I'd be curious to learn more about that. Continuing through the nest, the 4th item from the right, the 4th and the 5th, these are podcasts that came out just in the last few days. There were quite a lot. So sometimes I'll take the individual entries and I'll put them in the nest one by one, so you can explore them. In this case, I'll just say, do head to that one that's titled, July 20th Spaces Agenda Podcasts. And it includes a monk debate on potential NATO membership for Ukraine. It includes an interview from John Spencer, who is a friend of ours who often participates in Twitter spaces on the Ukraine war, who interviewed a well-known fighter, Sergeant Arseny Fedoziuk, who was with the Azov battalion in Mariupol, which should be a fascinating talk. There is a podcast from Rubrica about efforts to recover in the areas that were affected by the destruction of the Kakova Dam. There is a new documentary put together by the Kiev Independent called Uprooted, which is an investigation into Russia's forced deportation of Ukrainian children. And you'll see there's a lot of material in the last few days on this issue of the kidnapping and or deportation of Ukrainian children. So it seems to be an issue that's really rising to the forefront. There is also the latest episode of the Russia Contingency, which is the podcast that's put together by Michael Kaufman, who is a friend of ours. He came to speak with us about 2 weeks ago. He and some of his colleagues traveled to Ukraine fairly recently, and so he recorded this podcast with Rob Lee. Interestingly, it's distributed by War on the Rocks, as always. Usually the Russia Contingency is subscription only. In this case, they've decided to, I guess it's a lengthy interview, and they've split it into 2 parts, and the first part is free to listen. So you can find the link there. In the other block of podcasts, which starts with the phrase Interpol red notices, there were another 4 or 5, just to highlight them. Bill Browder tweeted out, it's an investigation put together by Sky News called Dirty Work, which discusses the misuse of Interpol red notices. And for those of you who don't know, Bill Browder, who was an investor in Russia and has become essentially a civil rights campaigner, he was fighting for adoption of new laws, particularly Magnitsky Acts, after his friend and lawyer Magnitsky, who was killed in Russian custody. And in response to that, Russia, alleged crimes against him and put out an Interpol red notice for him. And he, I think at least once, I think several times, was detained, but never actually extradited to Russia. And so he has quite an interest in this issue. And his first book, before freezing, his latest book is Freezing Order. His initial book was called Red Notice. The Aspen Security Forum was held over the last few days. There was a link in there to the video where they called it a fireside chat with Christo Grozev, who is one of the founders of Bellingcat. But if you do follow that link to the Aspen Security Forum website, it has the video of all their talks, and several of them are, would be interesting, I suspect, to our crowd on other fronts as well. There is a reading list there that I've said is the Kaufman recommended reading. So this was a thread of Michael Kaufman's saying, here are some articles from the last few weeks that seem to have held up well. So if they made predictions or applied analytical techniques, I believe it's 5 or 6 articles, he thinks did a good job sort of in hindsight. And I suspect that they contain, several other predictions or processes that will remain helpful in the next couple of weeks as the offensive continues. There is a podcast called The Price of Conviction that was put out in the last few days, and it is telling some of the story of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is one of the primary political prisoners in Russia. We covered his conviction, I think, a little over a month ago. They had initially arrested him for just a few months, and then they convicted him for, I believe it was something like 30 years on, trumped up charges. So if you'd like to learn more about his story, they just completed that podcast with a profile of him. Finally, there's a new episode of the podcast put out by Mark Galliotti, and the podcast is called In Moscow's Shadow, and this particular episode is called Where Have All of the Generals Gone? And it's discussing the changeover in military Russian command, similar to the issues we've talked about in our last 2 spaces. But if you missed those or you'd like to hear Mark's opinion, check the podcast out. So that was a surprising number of podcasts in the last few days. I'll move on to the resources. If you'll just bear with me a moment. So the tweet, it's right in the middle. I think it's the fifth from the left, titled Resources. John Conrad, who is a friend of ours, who runs the website G-Captain, covering a lot of maritime matters, highlighted a course that is made freely available, I believe, by MIT, into supply chain and humanitarian logistics. And I know that there are some among us who are interested in those issues, so I thought I'd raise that as an available educational opportunity. The second tweet in that post is a link to an article by The Drive, and Tyler Rogaway was writing about new changes that the U.S. military is thinking about instituting in an effort to make it harder to track military aircraft on sites like ADSB. And I don't think that it's a done deal, but I think that the military is leaning this way. It's partly about privacy, partly about security, but it would make the life of flight trackers harder. So if you'd like to learn more about the impending changes, check that article out. And if there are any options for advocacy, I suspect that sooner would be better than later. So if you feel strongly about that, get yourself up to date. And if any of you have suggestions about initiatives to try to pass along comments, for example, if the military has any option for a comment process, I would be interested to investigate that in a future space. The third item up there, it is a tweet from our friend Sam Bendet. And in this case, he is sending news coverage of a speech put together by the United Kingdom's intelligence chief, and
Oops, I think we lost you, Michael, a little bit.
While Michael gets his mic back, I would just draw your attention to the resources that are in the nest, and to retweet this space if you want to share the conversation with your followers and invite more people into the space and the conversation. I would also draw your attention to below in the replies, if you prefer to listen to the space or watch the space or engage with the space through the YouTube link. Our friends at OSINT-TV live stream the space, and the link is in the replies below.
Thanks for that, Jacoby. Apologies, guys. We, for those of you who don't know, I run these conversations from a phone emulator on a desktop, and occasionally it has to be restarted because it develops an error. So unfortunately, that happened early, but I'll just keep going. I was speaking to the last of the resources up in the nest, and the last point I think I was highlighting was the in the resources tweet, the tweet from Sam Bendet. It links to an article from the UK's intelligence chief, and in that he was talking about the role of artificial intelligence in national intelligence or security, and noting that there is absolutely a human element that it will be difficult for AI to replace. And so that essentially human spies or intelligence analysts aren't going anywhere. Then as a final resource, there's a tweet there that links to a new database that's being made public on Splash 24/7 that is a database of cyber attacks against maritime institutions, maritime businesses, which I thought was interesting because, given the events that are going on in the Black Sea, it's helpful to note that, cyber attacks happen in this industry as well. To keep in mind that Kinetic options aren't the only options for, kind of direct action. So it may be interesting to see if any cyber attacks ramp up in connection with the end of the Black Sea Grant Initiative. So I'll go to a couple of interesting examples. And in the nest, it's the third tweet from the left. There are a couple of good ones up there. Again, I won't break these out individually in the interest of time. The first is a tweet from Tom Shugart, who was tracking the sudden call and movement of several large ferries by the Chinese authorities to assist in exercises. And I just wanted to highlight this because there's been a lot of discussion about how commercial shipping will likely be heavily called on in the event that China were to attempt an invasion of Taiwan. And it's interesting to me that people are paying close enough attention to note how many or which particular ships have been called on to engage in these exercises in the past, so that you have a baseline in that if suddenly a lot of commercial ships began to move off their normal routes, towards staging areas or expected staging areas for an invasion, you'd get at least a little bit of notice. So I think it's great that Tom Shugart and folks like him are paying attention to that baseline. The second tweet up there is from Covert Shores, and he noted that Russia may be a little bit paranoid about the threat of drones. And so in advance of the Navy Day parade in St. Petersburg, he noted that one of their warships had put out with a GPS jammer on it. And in his post, he was trying to identify the jammer. And I think they got very close. I don't know that they got 100% identification of the system that was deployed. But that's an interesting development. It kind of reminds me of how people have noted Russia had been deploying ground-based air defense vehicles on ships. And it's sort of the same idea here, but now with electronic warfare assets instead of, direct air defense. The third item down there, it's a tweet from Tech Journalist. I appreciated this as an example of OSINT work because they identified that there is a civilian airport in Russia. I believe it's in St. Petersburg. That is has a significant portion of the ownership is held by German companies, and it's meant to be run for civilian purposes. However, the Russian military is now using it fairly consistently. So the implication is that these German-owned assets, or significantly German-owned assets, are being used by the Russian military, which obviously the German owners don't have complete control over under the circumstances. But I appreciated their use in this study of simultaneous satellite imagery and ground-based photographs of the aircraft, so you could see where the aircraft were taxiing from and taking off, and then they actually got registration numbers, and they could, by combining those means, prove that it was Russian military aircraft operating out of this civilian airport. As a final example in this block, there is a interesting project put together. It's in the tweet by Kendo Nagasaki, and it's a write-up that discusses the use of data visualization in war. And so they use the examples of Russian stolen grain, and then they also talk about databases on Russian shelling and how they can be visualized. So I thought if that's a skill that you're interested in applying in your own work, have a look at that. So as the last set of examples, because we are interested in OSINT generally, and it's not restricted only to Ukraine, I do like to highlight projects from around the world. You'll see it's about the fourth item from the left in the nest. There are some tweets here about ongoing projects in connection with the fighting that's going on in Sudan. And so the first is by the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and it's a new initiative called Sudan Shahid. And that outlet, C4ADS, does a lot of work covering Wagner. And so this is an interesting new development. but it caught my attention, partly because there was a second initiative. So it's interesting that two different Sudan initiatives were coming out at roughly the same time. So the second one is, you'll see it's the tweet by Warmapper, and he retweets a letter from OSINT Sudan, and it's a proposal for a capacity building initiative. And so I wanted to bring it to your attention to highlight that there's this new project. I don't know a lot about that organization, but I know that we have folks who listen to us from around the world and are interested in those parts as well. And when I included it in the agenda, I then had an individual reach out to me from that project. And so Mustafa has come up to join us, and he's offered to take a few minutes to explain what their new project is, in the event that any of you would be interested in contributing, OSINT analysis or effort to his project. So Mustafa, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Michael, for giving us the opportunity to speak.
So would you just let us know, what your project is trying to accomplish and what kind of help you'd like from folks like us?
Since the war broke out, there weren't a lot of people who are actually interested in OSINT in Sudan. And at the same time, there wasn't a lot of attention to the war because mainly it's a remote part of the world for many of the people who are following wars. So we got overwhelmed by the amount of videos and evidence that needs verification and geolocation and combating disinformation that's coming out of both warring parties. So we really appreciate the help that we've been getting from Warmapper, Daniel, and all the other OSINT community folks who actually participated in the war. But we would appreciate help in other fields that are currently lacking. So mainly geolocators, mappers, analysts, and specifically weapons specialists, because the weapons are very, very vital to identifying perpetrators and then promoting accountability in the future. So we really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope more people who are interested in following the war or participating reach out and start participating immediately. So it's not a closed initiative. It's for everyone who is willing to participate.
Well, that sounds interesting. It caught my attention to see that there were two initiatives on Sudan work at the same time. Out of curiosity, Mustafa, have you reached out at all to that other group I identified in the materials, the Center for Advanced Defense Studies?
Well, yes, the three of us who are actually present at this space are actually collaborating with the Center for Information Resilience, which is it's co-founder of this project, the Sudan Shahid project, which is mainly to, it's basically similar to All Eyes on Russia and the Myanmar project by Center for Information Resilience, which is basically to track, document, and map all of the incidents that are happening in this war.
Well, that's very interesting. And we've previously spoken about the, I believe it's called the Eyes on Malaysia project. I think they have Eyes on Sudan as well. So it's great that you're working with them. And so anybody interested should contact you.
Yeah, they can contact me or contact the OSINT Sudan, and we will guide them through how they can actually help in identifying all these different elements.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for coming just to give us a little bit of background on that. And I know that we have several listeners who are keen geolocators, although I know those skills are in high demand. But hopefully a few people who are listening have some time to help you out. And I'd invite you, Mustafa, perhaps in a couple of weeks, as you make progress with the initiative, if you'd like to come back and discuss any findings you've made, or if you've refined your need for assistance and you'd like to come back and repeat it, then just let me know, and we'd be happy to have you come and chat with us.
All right, thank you.
Okay, last 2 points in examples from the last couple of days. Again, this is in the tweet in the nest that is headed, the first phrase up there is the C4 ADS Sudan project. And if you were to scroll down, actually, what I'll do is I'll break these two out to the front of the nest so you can see them. So the first of these is a tweet from Elliot Higgins. I sometimes like to include a bit of a philosophical point. And in this case, Elliot of Bellingcat is harping on the issue of sourcing your claims. And he's saying that he sees a lot of OSINT accounts who are reposting video where they don't post the original source. And that he thinks generally the motivation for that is because it gives the impression that you have access to exclusive content. But if somebody first sees the information from your post and you don't post the source, if they want to do it in a rigorous way, they need to find that source, and it takes time. If you could have saved dozens or hundreds of people time, but you opt not to do it in an effort to, essentially collect follows on Twitter, that's not, it's almost counterproductive to the community. And so I tend to agree with that. For those of you who may follow me, you'll note that I don't take content and just rewrite it. I heavily retweet items, and I generally only write original items if it's something that hasn't, when I do a search for it, it hasn't already been added to Twitter. So I'm adding to the collective, and then I always include my sources. So I just took this as an opportunity to, highlight those best practices again. The last item, in terms of interesting examples from the last week, you'll see it's the second item in the nest. It's a tweet from our friend Radio and Nukes, and he put up a tweet where he had seen a lot of jamming in sort of a what looked like it may be circular pattern over the Black Sea, and he had thought, I wonder if you were to take a GPS jammer, because it was a very large area that was affected. And I was thinking, if you took a GPS jammer and you set it at a very high elevation, could a high-power jammer at high elevation create this large area of GPS interference? And so he put a tweet out essentially about that, saying, it looks like it's possible. So maybe something is based roughly, here, and he had a point on the map. But then others reached out to him and noted it was likely that the GPS interference was probably coming from I believe it was from some aircraft that were up over the Black Sea. And so he, interestingly to me, took the approach, instead of deleting the tweet because it didn't reflect what's actually happening, he took it as a learning opportunity to put up this, which is just to remind everybody that sometimes when you do this analysis, you start out with a wrong assumption or a hypothesis that turns out not to be true. And sometimes you have to work through that publicly. And I think that was an important point and helpful to the community to see somebody not just delete, but to say, look, I was wrong. This is the alternative solution. And even somebody who generally has a lot of technical insight will sometimes get it wrong. So it, is also a reminder to be careful when you in taking everything that comes from even sophisticated people as a statement of fact. Okay, that was it for the intro resources. I know I went a little bit longer than the 15 minutes. We're going to move on to a discussion about updates on the Black Sea and in general exports of Ukrainian grain. So we're joined by Exit, who on Sunday gave us a bit of a brief description on the last day before the deal was set to expire. But since then, we've had lots of developments. So, Exit, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I know you've prepared material, so just feel free to launch into it. And I did collect a fair number of sources, I think, along the same lines you're going to discuss. So as you run through material, I'll be adding items to the nest sort of in support of that. So to the audience, just keep your eye on the nest for some sources. But please go ahead.
Thank you. And I would invite, I know some of you down there feel passionately about what's going on in the Black Sea right now. So feel free to come up as speakers and contribute to the conversation. The Black Sea Grain Initiative did end, as far as we know, or at least for now, on Monday morning. It was honestly a little bit sad for some of us, especially me. It's been a long journey. It was almost exactly a year. If you saw some of my other posts, you know that I spend about 3 hours a day at least on this for 360 some odd days. So it's weird to not be doing it at the same level that we were doing it before. But the UN, even though at the time that the Black Sea Grain Initiative had quit, the last inspection was not done. The UN, you may not know, but the JCC, they actually record video and photos of every single inspection that they do for each ship. And so they were kind enough to post those out and allow some of us to post them up on our feeds and things and report on it. And that was a really interesting moment because we don't typically get to see that kind of information from the UN. So very, very cool. That happened on Monday. In the midst of that, Russia, obviously, Sunday night started with the attack on the Kerch Bridge. Things went boom. It was very interesting. I had just posted. I was finally sitting down to eat some dinner and checked Twitter and saw that the Kerch Bridge had gone boom. And that was not what I was expecting to see. Generally, that doesn't really happen. If you kind of have followed along, you probably saw that there was a USB attack. So unmanned surface vessel. And Russia has reported that there was 2 of the vessels that headed towards the Kerch Bridge. One of them for sure hit. At least one of them didn't seem to hit its target, which was apparently the rail bridge. But kind of an interesting event to have happen. And after that, Russia decided that they would retaliate by leaving the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and they notified early that next morning the JCC, so the UN and Turkey, that they were specifically not renewing the Black Sea Grain Initiative. They had really telegraphed that, so it wasn't all that surprising, but I would definitely say that the Kerch Bridge attack probably moved that up. If you're wondering if Ukraine specifically planned the Kerch Bridge attack to coincide with the renewal, we don't know the answer to that. But what we do know, and David did some analysis, he's down there, maybe he wants to come talk about this, but he did some analysis about the weather that night and why that was a particularly really interesting day for weather, had all of the right things that you would watch weather-wise to enable that USB attack, which was great in my opinion. But I would encourage you, I'm sure Mr. Bond will put that up in the nest, and I would encourage you to read through it because it was interesting to see all of the different bits that kind of pointed towards why that was particularly a good night. And then if you happen to follow MT Anderson, you will have seen that he and David actually were able to identify some small moving craft, which we don't know specifically what they were, but small moving craft that were headed from the Snake Island direction towards the Crimea direction. What exactly they were, it's hard to say because that's just from a Sentinel identification. But maybe, David, I'll let you speak on that or the weather, whichever you like.
Sure. Thanks, Exit. You and I had speculated about, well, because we were watching the weather in the Western Black Sea to see if the inspections were affected by weather, and we've been doing that for about 4 months together. Along the way, I think it was back in May, the quote Russian research vessel that was probably protecting one of the pipelines in the Southwest Black Sea apparently was attacked by these unpersoned surface vehicles, by maybe 2, right? There was some video that came out, and we speculated, well, gee, how'd they get there? Where'd they come from? How far did they go? And we kind of said, well, maybe it was 400 kilometers from far southwest Ukraine, and well, that's a long distance. Is it even possible? And then we looked at the weather, and it seemed like it was pretty quiescent. Like the winds were from the north, but pretty light, and the seas swells were maybe less than a meter the whole distance. 400 kilometers, and we thought, maybe that's what you look for when there's going to be an attack on the target. So I remembered all that, and I said, I better do a data save, and see what the conditions were to see if they line up with, what the kinds of weather and sea surface you might expect with these kind of vessels, which I don't know what the technical specifications are, but I'm trying to back into it from what we see when there are attacks. And sure enough, it seemed similar to what we saw exit in May with the research vessel. But the distance obviously was longer. It's about 600 kilometers, I think, to the nearest point, and on the towards the Gulf of Odessa. And the other key, I think the illumination was minus or 1%, so it was a new moon. And I thought, well, if it's obviously the attack happened at 3 a.m. in the morning, and perhaps wasn't a coincidence that it was a new moon, and these dark vessels were trying to get as close as they could before optical folks detected them and were able to take them out, which they got in pretty damn close. So anyway, that's the exercise.
What I think is the coolest part about David's work is that he's not concentrating on trying to figure out what it was that attacked the bridge. He's concentrating on trying to figure out what his specialty is and how it could contribute to part of the story. And that's part of what I really love about talking to David about pretty much everything, because he brings up things that I just wouldn't even begin to think about. And it's really great to have that kind of information come at you and lots of questions be asked, because it invariably, A, makes you stick to what you're good at and what you know, and B, makes you think of things that you wouldn't necessarily consider, which is really neat. So the Kerch Bridge happened, Russia pulled out. Ukraine immediately responded with saying, hey, we're not done with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We signed a contract with the UN and Turkey specifically. We didn't actually sign a contract with Russia, and we'd like to continue. And that's awesome. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like there is the same sentiment from both the UN and Turkey at the moment. And you saw a lot of back and forth with Ukraine reaching out to Turkey, reaching out to the UN and letting them know that they wanted to move forward. They already had Kulaba pre-positioned in New York at the UN and specifically doing interviews on Monday morning. They had, on the weekend previous to Monday, they had invited a bunch of really high-profile African journalists to come and visit the Odessa ports. And then on Monday morning, as Russia was pulling out of the deal, Zelensky was meeting with those reporters specifically. And so they were able to ask him questions about what would happen to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, what Ukraine was trying to do, what the implications were for those things. They also had teams from the UN visiting both the ports of Odessa and Reni that morning. They were doing evaluations on how to increase traffic, how to reduce the wait times for inspections, things like that. There are some really specific UN teams that go in and will do that for different countries with their customs. And they had scheduled all those meetings for Monday morning so that it was very apparent that they wanted to continue with their partners. And we got to Monday night, and there was a large attack on Odessa. If you saw Peskov's comments the next morning, he specifically said that that attack was related to the Kerch Bridge attack. David and I have gone back and forth a lot discussing this, and if anybody else has different comments on it, I would welcome them. But we really feel that that bridge attack was kind of, it was added on to the reasoning for those missile attacks. We feel that, as I've stated a number of times before, there's always an increase in attacks when the renewal dates come up for the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and it's very unlikely that Russia didn't intend to do that again. So they attacked on Monday night. That attack was large, but it didn't do a huge amount of damage. They didn't have a lot of direct hits, and it's likely that they were trying to assess the air defense situation in Odessa, because then on Tuesday and Wednesday night, and I haven't actually checked yet tonight, Tuesday and Wednesday night, though, they did attack both the port of Chernомorsk and the port of Odessa specifically. And they have made direct hits. They've used ship-to-shore missiles that Ukraine doesn't seem to have an answer for. John, I don't know if you wanted to talk about those specific missiles at all. And they did a lot of damage. They've taken out 60,000 metric tons of grain. They've taken out, last night's attack took out the Port Authority, part of the Port Authority building. They've hit some of the Viterra stuff. There's a good deal of damage that they've done there. Jacoby's hand went up, I think. We'll go to her first.
I'm happy to wait. You guys are talking about the damage in Odessa, so I'm happy to wait for other people, particularly John, to speak up. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Yeah, regarding those missiles, specifically, I need to go pull up an exact breakdown of which missiles were launched, but I believe a majority of them were 3M55 Onyx, which is a supersonic anti-ship missile with a secondary land attack capability. It can be launched by Russian surface combatants, but in practice, it has been mostly launched from shore batteries in Crimea. Thus far, I'm not aware of any publicly claimed interceptions of maybe only one of Onyx by Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. It seems that their legacy Soviet SAM systems are largely incapable of addressing supersonic aerodynamic threats. So that's specifically going to be Onyx as well as the KH-22. Both Patriot and SAMP-T should be able to address that threat to some extent. And NASAMs eventually, if they were provided with AMRAAM-ER, they may be able to defeat Onyx as well, given that AMRAM-ER is essentially an evolved C Sparrow derivative, and evolved C Sparrow is specifically designed to defeat supersonic anti-ship missiles for the U.S. Navy.
So I had a question about that. The Patriot should be able to intercept them. I know at least one person who lives in Odessa who has told me that there is at least one of those systems there. I assume that it would only have coverage of certain areas, though, and maybe might be focused on civilian areas and not the port. Can you kind of explain the range issues that might occur there?
Yeah, so there could be some range issues. The thought that comes to my mind is that depending on how much Onyx is maneuvering in flight, it may potentially be more problematic for PAC-2, specifically GIM-T, which is one of the interceptors for Patriot that Ukraine is operating. That's the longest range one, with about 160-kilometer range against, at the very least, subsonic aerodynamic threats. GIM-T may have some issues with it. PAC-3 should certainly be, or PAC-3 CRI, I should say, should certainly be maneuverable enough to deal with a threat like that. That said, PAC-3 CRI only has, I think, an unclassified range of about 35 kilometers against quote-unquote aerodynamic threats. So the footprint that it can cover is going to be drastically reduced. And it's more than likely that those Patriots are protecting specific critical infrastructure, specific military assets or infrastructure, rather than the urban area itself, per se.
Thanks for that. Colby, did you want to go ahead?
Thanks.
Sorry about that. There must have been, as we were bringing a speaker up, must have accidentally hit the button. Please go ahead.
Thanks. John, is it fair to say in this situation that it's not just the interceptor range, but also the ability of the radar to actually spot the incoming missile and have sufficient time to get the interceptor onto target?
Yes, that is also a concern, particularly in the absence of any sort of airborne sensor, like any kind of airborne early warning aircraft, and especially since I believe Onyx is a sea skimmer or pretty close to it. So, yeah, depending on how its flight profile is configured, I'm not sure off the top of my head if it sea skims the entire flight path or if it cruises at medium altitude and then drops down the sea skim before it crosses over before it crosses into the line of sight of its target. But ideally, you would want basically radars quite literally on the seashore, looking out in the general direction of Crimea to give yourself the maximum early warning. And the other issue with Patriot is that for both, as a practical matter, even though PAC-3 CRI and MSC don't require the target to be illuminated by Patriot's organic radar, the MPQ-65, unlike the PAC-2 and the GIM family, that missile still needs to be roughly in that frontal conical arc of the radar, because that radar provides the data link to the missile that is used to pass essentially intercept data generated from those offboard sensors to correct the missile in flight. So that, I believe the MPQ-65 would still need to have line of sight to the interceptor throughout the entire duration of engagement. So that kind of also constrains the geography of where you can deploy these systems.
That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate all the times I get to learn from you. Jane, go ahead.
Thanks. Hey, yeah. Hey, David, I have a question for you and a question for Exit. Actually, no, I'm gonna leave hardware be because we exhausted that last night, and you're just kind of curious about the Onyx, but I will let that rock. as far as what is being protected in Odessa, how do you see them apparently not being able to or not choosing to in the, sort of picking your priorities, protecting the port infrastructure? Specifically, I'm wondering if they are able to protect the docks and all of the capabilities needed to get the green initiative or any type of port activity going if they're going to be moving things in and out of the port. Any thoughts on that?
So before...
I'm sorry, that was really, really random on my part. I'm trying to do three things at once. Do you think the fact that it appears they are not able to protect, or they're choosing not to, with their priorities, protect the port infrastructure itself, problematic going forward if the Russians continue to go after the port?
So I asked a lot of questions about this before we even got to the renewal. And the thing that people brought up to me time and time again is that you have to protect people before you protect infrastructure. And as important as the ports are, protecting your people is more important. That said, like John was just saying, it appears that Russia is using some weapons that Ukraine doesn't seem to have the ability to address in the way that they need to. And that's what's really causing the major portion of the damage right now. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they only have so much ability and so many assets, and you have to protect your people before the part. Spicy, I saw you raise your hand there.
No, so I actually I put my hand down because you nailed it. I'm an air defender by trade, so you have to choose the assets that you defend with the limited number of defensive assets that you have. So when you go through that math, are you protecting the city center or the port and the grain facilities? And so clearly Ukraine has had made a tough choice and has made this choice. So that's why I raised my hand. Thanks, Exit.
Yay, I like that. That's good. And let me point out also, in the Odessa area, the Ports for the Black Sea Grain Initiative, there's 3 separate ports, and they are geographically not co-located. So you're protecting a really large swath of land. And if you only have one Patriot and then a whole bunch of other systems, and they're using weapons that are designed to get past those other systems, you can only do so much before they're going to make contact with what they're trying to hit. And that's really what we're getting into. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Thank you. One thing I just wanted to add, I guess related to the earlier discussion of, how planned in advance was this. One thing that's worth keeping in mind is that the Russian targeting and mission planning cycle for these types of raids is not the fastest thing in the world, as of, I believe, per Bellingcat and Insider.ru, investigative journalism piece from, I believe, October of last year, concerning the first large raid on the 10th of October, the beginning of the infrastructure strike campaign. Their estimate was that the mission planning process took about a week to complete. So I remember at the time there was a lot of discussion that was retaliation for the Kerch Bridge. It wasn't. It was already in the works days beforehand, before the bridge was struck. So it's likely the same case here. This was probably already being planned for at least a couple of days. The process described in that October report was rather laborious. They were having to individually simulate the complete flight route for each of the munitions, and then I think they were having to physically transfer the guidance and targeting data on flash drives from Moscow to the Black Sea Fleet and Russian long-range aviation assets. So it's probably going to take them at least 24, 48, probably maybe 72 hours, assuming their targeting cycle has improved, and it probably has, to be able to prepare something like this.
I love having so many experts here. It's awesome. Thank you to each of you. I'll just note a few other quick things that happened on Tuesday. We saw the U.S. Samantha Power with USAID was meeting in Odessa with a number of different Ukrainian officials. So again, trying to portray that it's a safe area, that they can continue shipping, all of those types of things. We got some responses back from Kenya that day about how specifically the foreign minister called out Russia for canceling the Black Sea Grain Initiative and not continuing it. It was nice to actually see some African governments kind of pushing back on that, because that isn't something that we had seen publicly as much. One of the insuring companies pulled out, not all of them, only one specifically pulled back for the time being. The biggest one, Lloyd's, or Ascot of Lloyd's, has not yet commented. And so we're now 4 days into it, and they still haven't commented on whether or not they will continue insurance, which I consider to be a really positive thing. So that's something to watch as well. Chikubi, you had some questions?
Yeah, I sure did, Exit. I wanted to ask a bit about the planning going into motion for alternatives to moving grain. And as I understand it, there's efforts afoot to move grain possibly through Romania, through use of rail and the Danube. And so I wanted to hear from people about those efforts, as well as you had started to allude to it here, a shift that seems to be happening in some African countries who had been deferential to Russia up to now, and seem to be shifting their allegiance somewhat, realizing, I'm sure they realized it before, but now it's becoming very apparent, the change in grain prices, the availability of grain, their allegiance to Russia and deference to them in the face of that, and how they may be shifting very slowly but surely, possibly, toward looking toward the West for some answers, some alternatives, some support. So I wanted to hear some about that. But if you're not done talking about the sort of munitions side of things, I'm happy to wait.
So I guess the first thing that happened that kind of signaled what Ukraine wants to continue doing is that on Wednesday morning, they released or requested the IMO to disseminate to their members. So the IMO is the UN organization that International Mariners Organization, run or part of the UN, which controls the seas essentially. And they asked them to disseminate to their followers or members basically new guidelines of how to access the Odessa area ports, which specifically include a new route that stays much closer to the coastline. I know Sal put up, he had the scoop on it and put up all of the information that the IMO sent out. And John Conrad was here earlier, and he put up a really great article kind of explaining some of that. I know, John Ridge, you went back and did a whole bunch of reading about it. but it specifically outlines that the new route would go through mostly Romanian waters and then straight into Ukrainian water. So there wouldn't be, instead of operating on the outside of Snake Island, they would operate on the inside of Snake Island. And that would prevent them from being in most of the international water, which means that for Russia to board a ship, for instance, they'd actually have to go into Romanian water or Ukrainian water to do that, which would bring them back into a closer distance to the shore, which may put them at risk of some of the weapon systems, as well as would force them to, if they wanted to board within Romanian waters, they'd have to actually enter a different country's waters, and that, again, would be an issue. Jacoby?
Yeah, I'm happy to listen to more about this, but also want to interject some on the movement by Poland and Hungary to push back on Ukrainian grain exports and how that affects Ukraine's efforts to continue to move grain. And it seems that Poland, I think, and Hungary have renewed their opposition to Ukraine's grain exports, and how that could be alleviated. It seems like, that opposition from, seemingly supportive countries, as in Poland, less so Hungary. That's another sort of thorn in their side. But trying to appease concerns of Poland in the process of finding alternative ways to move grain would be something that Ukraine would have to put at the forefront of how they deal with things. But I don't know if that's been addressed to any great degree yet, or if that's even on the top of Ukraine's list of what they need to deal with up top.
So maybe we'll let Sal talk really quick about the IMO post that he put up and explain anything that I missed on there. And we can come back to that, because I'm just trying to get through it a little bit in a timeline, and that doesn't happen.
I'm happy to wait. Great.
Go ahead, Sal.
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well, Exit, that IMO, what Ukraine did is through their embassy in London at the International Maritime Organization, have them forward out that they're establishing that new route, as you explained, and it basically falls under their territorial waters, except for the very last part where they have to actually go offshore a bit to come into the terminal complex at Odessa. And so they posted that out, and then immediately you had Russia come out and announce that any vessels sailing to Ukraine would be considered to be carrying military cargo. And so that element kind of ratcheted up. To go back to the argument about why this is so important, and you're exactly right about the issue with Poland and Hungary, but the bigger issue is, while some of the grain is being moved by road, rail, John Conrad did a great article today over at GCAPTAIN entitled Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which basically talks about why it's very difficult to move grain this way. Just to put it into an easy context, they moved 32.9 million tons of grain out. A normal rail car can move about 100 tons. So you would need 320,900 trains to do this. And then the problem you have is the grain is in Poland, Hungary, and Romania. It's not where it needs to go. It still needs to be transported. So even just getting the grain out of Ukraine on a short distance doesn't really alleviate that. And the problem that Poland and Hungary has is that they have finite amount of space to store grain. And a lot that happens in the grain trade, particularly when it comes to exporting grain, is to hold grain until markets really peak and you can sell that grain for a high price. And if you're inundated with grain, you got to clear it out. And that means you're selling your grain at a much lower price. And so this is having a huge economic downturn in Eastern Europe in terms of the economy, and just the simple fact that you cannot move the amount of grain necessary out of Ukraine without using ships. Yes, they're using ports down on the Danube, and we're seeing some trucked and railed across, but nowhere near the size. When you look at a kind of even just a medium size vessel that can haul grain out, you're talking about something that can carry maybe about 500 rail car loads out. That's 50,000 tons, and then that's a pretty small size bulker, to tell you the truth.
And just for the sake of the audience, a number of the items that we've been referring to, I've added to the nest as the conversation's gone on. And so you'll see the first item is actually a link to the video that Sal did in his series, What's Going On with Shipping. And the article that John Conrad wrote about, planes, trains, automobiles is the second item in the nest. And then the U.S. announcement that it wouldn't be backing that initiative to try to channel the Ukrainian shipping route close to, Romanian shores is the third item back. And then if you keep scrolling back in the nest, there have been several other items up there, including about insurance and the apparent reports of Russia laying mines. So just keep an eye on the nest. It's all up there. I guess we'll go to Jacoby, and then I think Exit maybe has more to work through in the timeline. But go ahead, Jacoby.
Yeah, just to Sal's point there about the reasoning behind Hungary and Poland's objections or concerns about grain flowing from Ukraine. If they have finite space, and as you say, the idea is to hold on to grain until the price rises such that it's more attractive to then sell grain at that higher rate. Would not the sharp increase that we've seen in wheat prices in the last few days speak to that, or is that just do you think a momentary blip in the price, or is that a price that would probably be a sustained increase for a while that might help alleviate that problem that Hungary and Poland foresee in not being able to move grain from their limited storage facilities?
Well, remember, a lot of that jump that's being seen right now is in future prices, not so much in current prices. So that's one of the reasons why you'd want to hold your specific grain in your silos, in your storage facility until you can get it out. And again, the other thing you don't want to do is flood the market with too much product. The issue we've been talking about for a long time was when this all started, what was going to be the impact of Ukrainian grain not initially being on the market, and then all of a sudden it came on the market last July. And fortunately, the market has been such that there's been a pretty good steady supply of grain out from other countries around the world. We really didn't see massive shortages take place. But the problem is the market's very, very picky. The Rhine River is falling right now. There's concern that the river traffic is going to start drying up in Europe, which means that a lot of crops cannot get out that need to get out from the interior of Europe. If the Rhine's going, that means the Elbe, the Vistula, a lot of other rivers will also see its shortage. And when that happens, a lot of that grain that's stored has to be loaded onto barges, and then you can't load the barges to full capacity, which takes more travel. And this is one of the reasons why Poland and Hungary get so concerned about the influx of so much grain into their silos. Plus, it's a long passage out of the Baltic up on a bulk carrier coming out there. You can't really load really huge bulk carriers coming out of the Baltic. And so you have to do it in much more smaller, medium-sized vessels. And so, again, it's the best interest of the countries are all coming to play here at the same time. But I think that one of the things that stood out for me today is I can't help but notice that the United States posted, the Central Command in the Persian Gulf posted a notice that they were reinforcing the Persian Gulf today because of threats against freedom of the seas being exercised by Iran. Yet we saw no similar thing being come from NATO or the United States European Command on that. I'm not talking about surging ships up into the Black Sea, but threats against international seaways in the Black Sea don't seem to be garnering the same attention as they are in other areas.
And I'd just say, like, yes, grain prices have gone up a bit. They're nowhere near where they were earlier last year. And they really, in the broad scale of things, they haven't moved as much as a lot of people expected them to when this fell apart, because there is lots of grain available in Brazil right now. Lots of other people are harvesting their grain right now. There's a decent amount of grain out there, and there isn't a huge demand right at this particular moment. Spicy year, Mike is open for some reason. Thank you. And as much as prices have gone up, they haven't gone up as high as farmers would like to have them go up. The only thing I wanted to mention from yesterday is that Covert Shores H.I. Sutton did a really great thread outlining the different risks that ships could face from Russia's Black Sea fleet and just Russia's capabilities. And if you're interested in what those are, how they operate, things like that, I really encourage you to go back and read that thread. It was super useful to me. And it was nice to read it through and ask him some questions and get a few answers there. And then this morning, we saw the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine come out, and they likewise said, okay, any ships headed to Russian-controlled Black Sea ports will be treated as if they are carrying military cargo. I want to preface this entire thing by saying that targeting commercial ships is bad. Absolutely nobody should be doing that. These are not like protected ships. These are not ships that should have anything to do with a war in any way, shape, or form. However, it wasn't Ukraine that started this. On February 24th of last year, it was Russia that specifically targeted commercial ships. And we haven't really done anything to change that. And now the Black Sea Grain Initiative has fallen apart. And that's why we're here. And that's why we watched Ukraine make this same announcement today. I think there's a number of reasons they probably did this. But I don't think we know exactly what they are yet. We probably need to wait and see what the responses are from other countries. They're definitely trying to add pressure in some way. And it's just, we'll have to wait and see if that pressure is effective in the ways that they mean it. What else am I missing here? Sorry, I'm going through so many. Go ahead, Mr. Bond.
There were a series of comments where on one of those Russian evening shows where they talk about strategy, there was a suggestion from a commentator that Russia mine in the expected paths of the cargo ships, and that they could use that for plausible deniability purposes. And then apparently the United States, I think a spokesman for the National Security Council, I think, by the way, it's up in the nest. It's the tweet about 4 or 5 back from, sorry, let me just find it. Status 6, it's about 7 back, actually. So the NSC spokesperson said they believe that there has been a coordinated effort to lay mines and to justify attacks against civilian ships in order to lay blame on the Ukrainians. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that as a risk.
It's absolutely a risk. David was kind enough to do the currents in the Black Sea today and show where any unencumbered mines, for instance, might actually float. And right now they would mostly all float towards Odessa and kind of the Yuzhny area. David, correct me if I've gotten any of that wrong. We'll go with that. And like just generally affecting shipping ports or shipping lines with mines is a really bad thing. Shutting down shipping back and forth across the Black Sea in general is a really bad thing. Having mines floating around, we've seen over the extent of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, number one, we have not seen any ship in the Black Sea Grain Initiative hit a mine. The very first ships that came out on the very first day of the initiative were led by a tug. One tug or two tugs, I can't remember. Sorry, that's a while ago. And that's the only time that they've actually had an escort out. The rest of the time, they haven't had issues with mines, even though there have been floating mines. There's been floating mines in Odessa, Romania, Georgia, and Turkey have all had repeatedly floating mines. Romania has, even this morning, has their demining ships out and patrolling yet again for more mines. It's a big issue, and it's not just a big issue for big commercial ships. It's a big issue for little fishing boats out trying, like grandpa and grandma trying to get food on the table, those kinds of things. Mines are bad. We shouldn't have mines out there. I don't know what else to say about that other than it's not good. Mr. Bond?
So I maybe have two more questions for you. Before I get to that, I'll just mention to the listeners that on the economic front, we might not have time to get into some of the economic details, but I do like to pull the material out. So if you look at the third and fourth items back, I've just put sort of the whole block of materials up there that speak to everything from continued efforts to ship out of the Danube to the extension of EU bans for import of Ukrainian products in those 5 countries. There are some graphs there about how the Black Sea Grain Initiative has affected global grain prices. So, if you want background material, it's all up in the nest. I suppose my 2 questions to you. The first is, if you look at the items 1 and 2 in the nest, JD Work, who is sort of a strategist, he does cyber work mainly, but he thinks broadly, notes that a lot of the value of the Black Sea Grain Initiative may actually have come from the strategic stability that it offered, in that because there's an understanding, there was less likelihood that forces were going to come into proximity or bump into each other. And he in other tweets of his, he's noted that, the Russian Navy may feel they may have a bit of a grudge with the sinking of the Moskva and their minimization in the role in the war. And so they may be a bit on edge. So I thought that was an interesting perspective on the value of the stability. But then at the same time, the second item in the nest, you have high-profile folks like Admiral James Stavridis, who is essentially saying that NATO is very capable of responding if Russia were to begin attacking cargo ships, and that others have said things like, I think it was Blake Hertzinger who said there should be flags of every nation heading to the Black Sea right now. What do you think is going to happen on that front? Do you think these calls are going to get through to policymakers?
So just on the economic front, that the value of the Black Sea Grain Initiative absolutely was stability in the market. What was especially frustrating about that is that we went from a number of months where there was great stability and there was lots of grain leaving and everybody was really happy, to Russia pissing around with wait times for inspections and causing so much instability that the Black Sea Grain Initiative eventually lost any value that it had, and that risk got priced into the market. And so you saw grain prices move around based on that risk. At the exact same time, getting back to Jacoby's point, you saw the countries that are adjacent, the EU countries that are adjacent to Ukraine, talk to the EU and say, hey, we don't want this grain coming in, sitting in our ports anymore. You need to do something about that. And so they put a EU ban on Ukrainian grain coming into those specific countries, but it was still allowed to transship, which means specifically that they could send that grain through those ports as long as it was basically pre-sold and ready to be loaded. It could never really wait at those ports. That ban goes until September 15th. What Jacoby is talking about is that each of those 5 countries has now gone to the EU today and said that they want to extend that ban to at least the end of the year, which would enable them to get out portions of their new harvest that is obviously happening at the exact same time as Ukraine. And that would help raise prices for their farmers, which is important because their farmers get really unhappy that they can't sell their grain. That doesn't really solve the issues from Ukraine. And you still get back to the part that Sal was talking about you can only move so much grain by rail and by truck. And economically, the best way to do it is by ship. And the Danube River ports can handle some of that capacity, but not all of it, despite the amount of work and money that's been invested in those ports in the last year and in the next 3 years already is planned for those ports. You just cannot make up for the amount of grain that you could ship out of Odessa area ports. It's just not economically viable. That said, as I mentioned, that risk is pretty much already priced into the market, and I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement on that. David did remind me of one quick thing about the Ukraine's declaration regarding the commercial shipping. That has the ability to raise the risk factor for ensuring those Russian ships that go, or the ships that go to Russian controlled ports. And it's possible that that could change the kind of insurance field for those ships and could cause enough of an issue that either Russian grain could then be so expensive that it gets priced out of the market from where it's been. It has been advantageous to buy that Russian grain so far because it's generally been priced lower than lots of the other options. If you have to pay more for your insurance for your shipping, that's not going to be the case anymore. And it might be that lots of the other grain that's out there on the market might become might have more of a compete factor with the Russian pricing that they've had before. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of your question.
It was calls by the likes of Admiral Stavridis that Western nations should get more involved in protecting ongoing transit of grain ships.
That's the $1 million question that nobody has an answer to. Colby, if you have an answer to that, have at her, buddy.
Not going to happen. Turkey closed the straits, so nobody that isn't a Black Sea state is getting their warships into the Black Sea. And even if that wasn't the case, the United States has been signaling pretty much since the beginning that they don't have any interest in getting very involved in this particular aspect of the war. So I don't have any particular hope that there's any sea cavalry to the rescue here. I think that it's basically on Erdogan to try and figure out what he's willing to do to try and get these grain shipments to resume, because I firmly believe that he does want that to happen. And if he thinks that there's a way for it to happen, he's going to try and do that. But the issue is Russia has the capability to deny a great deal of the Black Sea to any vessel, whether it's military or civilian. The Onyx missile, which we were discussing earlier, has considerable range. Michael put up a tweet of mine into the nest. That's a map that will let you visualize the range of that missile. This is a very capable missile. As we were discussing earlier, the Ukrainians do not have the reliable ability to intercept this missile. So it's a question of what is Russia willing to do? What is Turkey willing to do? What is Russia willing to do? That's really the question here. Who's going to blink, right? Is somebody willing to stick their neck out and test the other and see what they're willing to do? Because neither of them obviously want to get into an escalating shooting war here. So there's going to be a lot of political maneuvering here and trying to just outmaneuver the opposition, because Russia seemingly does not want grain exports to happen, and Turkey really wants them to. So it's really between those two countries in my mind. The United States or anybody else, nobody else is coming to the rescue here. So Turkey is going to be the decisive player in this question.
Exit, do you want to come back in, and then we'll go to Patrick and then around?
Yeah, I would say you're 100% right. I have said all along that Turkey is the deciding factor here. Keep your eyes on him. Whatever Erdogan does is going to make a big difference to the Black Sea Grain Initiative or any prospect at all of continuing exports. They have a massive reason to continue it because it affects their economy, and their economy is no good at the moment. But it affects it both ways in that it's useful because a lot of the grain goes through their ports and gets transshipped and processed and all of these other things. But also they have big economic alliances with Russia. So it's not just a one-way field here. They have to play both sides of it. And if there's anything we know about Erdogan, it's that Erdogan plays for Erdogan. I forget the rest of what I was going to say, so go ahead.
Patrick, go ahead, and then we'll go to Jane.
Thanks, Michael. And Jacoby, I know this, or Exit, sorry, I know this has been your kind of issue throughout the war, so I'm sorry to see it kind of taking this turn, but I think Colby's right about this. I was shocked that Russia has allowed the BSGI to go on as long as it has. I expected them to start this kind of, these kind of shenanigans months ago, sometime last year, because and Jacoby, or why do I keep calling you Jacoby? Exit's right. Strangling the Ukrainian economy and pressuring the West, via the developing world, which is where a lot of these grain shipments go, is a good tactic for them. It's especially a good tactic going into the U.S. Election cycle. It's another pressure point, and as awful as it is, even the calls of this is unprecedented are not going to find a whole lot of historical basis. We did this to Japan. The Germans did it to the Brits twice. Blockading your enemy and trying to cut them off from international economic intercourse is not unprecedented. It's going to get ugly really quick in this case because it's obviously food shipments, but it's something that the Russians frankly should be doing. From their perspective, they should be doing it. And I have to agree with Colby again. I don't think anybody is going to risk trying to run this blockade, not only because the Turks are likely to prove a bit sticky on the agreements surrounding transiting the Bosphorus, but simply because nobody wants to get into a shooting war with the Russians over this. And that is what you'd be risking. Everyone kind of held their breath several months ago when we had that incident with the U.S. drone, because it was the Russians bringing down a U.S. asset, and everyone really looked at that and said, oh, God, we're really, in a position where you have Russian and American military assets, and they're damaging, and in the case of the drone, destroying one another. We really don't want that. And you saw the Biden administration back off pretty hard, which, understandable. That's a judgment call. I don't think you then see that same administration petitioning Ankara to send, U.S. destroyers through the Dardanelles in order to protect Black Sea grain shipments. And if the U.S. isn't going to do it, the rest of NATO almost certainly is not willing to take that step. So I think, unfortunately, I think Colby has the right of this one.
So just to try and keep the back and forth going, why don't we go to Sal and then Colby? Go ahead, Sal.
Yeah, I just two things on what Colby said. One, the idea of the Black Sea Grain Initiative made the most sense for Russia to make it, in my opinion. I look at this not from a military side, but from a purely commercial side. In terms of Russia, their most important thing they got out so far of the war is opening up the Sea of Azov to the inland waterway system that connects from Rostov into the Don River, the Volga, the Caspian, all the way up to the Moscow Canal, to the White and the Baltic Sea. That is, for them, the absolute essential is to be able to export their food, their fuel, their fertilizer. That is what keeps their economy going. And allowing Ukraine to export some grain via the Black Sea Grain Initiative in return for them having unfettered ability to get out at least food and fertilizer was a win-win for them, especially when they started losing some control of the Gulf of Odessa with the loss of Snake Island, with the Moskva sinking, with the attacks on Sevastopol. This worked out, I would argue, for them extremely well. I don't think, the issue here is not so much surging Burke-class destroyers up onto the Black Sea. I mean, NATO could provide protection from shore. They don't need to be on there. But I think the issue is going to be, it's not going to be President Biden running a ship up to Ukraine. It's going to be a commercial company with a Liberian flag vessel with a Filipino crew that's going to do it. And let's remember, back in the 80s, there were plenty of people who were running tankers up to Iraq, to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, to Bahrain, and got shot at on a regular basis for the bulk of the tanker war long before the U.S. ever got involved in it in the late 80s, in 87, 88, when the Kuwaitis reflagged their tankers. So the question really becomes is there a profitability for commercial companies to run their ships to Ukraine to get a load of grain out of the port and come back? If Ukraine is going to underwrite it with war risk insurance, then you may see some ships start running up there, regardless of whether or not there's escorts or not. They'll run along the coast and get up there to get a load out, particularly if grain prices start to spike all of a sudden. And then that question then becomes, is if the Russians start hitting grain ships coming out of the Ukraine, does Ukraine counter with ships coming out of the Kerch Strait and out of other Black Sea ports? And my fear, the thing I talk about a lot, is what happens when this tit-for-tat escalation starts hitting the commercial ships. If you're hitting grain ships coming out of Ukraine, you start hitting these commercial ships. Don't have to be Russian ships. Could be these again, Liberian, Panamanian, Marshall Island flag vessels start getting hit. And to tell you the truth, nobody cares about commercial ships with commercial crews on board. That's not going to generate a lot of concern. It only becomes a concern when there's a political element to it. We saw that at the very beginning of this war when commercial ships were hit by the Russians, both in port and in the Gulf of Odessa.
Thanks for that, Sal. Those are great points. One thing I probably should have come in with right after Patrick's comment was Patrick made reference to when the Russian jet buzzed the U.S. drone and how people, that kind of raised people's alarm bells. But what got less coverage was about a week ago, there were 3 days in a row where Russia engaged in those same behaviors, I believe, in Syria. And so at this point, I don't know that it's even tied to the Black Sea, and that if Russia keeps that strategy up, as opposed to, perhaps it's a bad idea to be in proximity over the Black Sea, it would be, Russia is being belligerent in, a bunch of different spheres, and I think that an incident there would change the calculus back in the other way potentially. But I understand we're mixing issues, so we'll try and keep it on track. I'm going to go to Colby and then exit.
Thanks. So on the question of Russia's motivation to be in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which Patrick raised, and to Sal's point about, they have their own economic interest in being in that agreement, which I agree with, and I would add that Patrick mentioned that it was sort of a useful economic weapon for them against Western states, but I would say that the countries that have the most to lose from not having access to that grain is actually African states and other developing countries around the world, which Russia has had pretty good relations with a lot of these countries historically and continues to. Obviously, Wagner is very active in many places around Africa. Russia has close ties with China, India. Global food prices affect everybody, but they especially affect the economies that are less wealthy, right? And a lot of those countries are friendly or more non-aligned. So I think that Russia, has likely been getting some pushback from some of these countries about the fact that the loss of the grain initiative is very damaging to their economies. And obviously the Ukrainians are very astutely aware of that. And they took advantage of that by inviting the African journalists to Odessa, which Exit had mentioned earlier. On the question of, proceeding without any sort of military escort, the commercial ships could get insurance and they could just go for it and, see what happens without any sort of military escort. But what happens when Russia decides that they're going to sink a few of them? Are many ships going to take that risk afterwards? I don't know. I wouldn't. I mean, what crew is going to want to make that trip knowing that 2-3 ships in front of them just got sunk by a cruise missile? And, the unfortunate reality is Ukraine, despite their statements that they will consider, any Russian ship a valid target, Ukraine does not have the same capacity to respond that Russia does. Russia has the upper hand with anti-ship missiles in terms of both numbers and in range. So I'll have to make another map maybe showing the comparison of what Russia can do with its Bastion P coastal batteries versus Ukraine's very limited number of Harpoons and even more limited number of Neptune missiles. So there's not balance in this domain. Russia has a very decisive upper hand in the ability to interdict any naval vessels operating the Black Sea. And if they want to shut things down, they can. And Ukraine has much more limited capacity to respond in kind if Russia decides to go that route.
So to play devil's advocate for a moment, Colby, I saw a graphic the other day that said that Turkey has 80 some main combat ships in its navy, and Russia only has 14 in the Black Sea at the moment. So, isn't that a mismatch? I don't know if you saw that graphic go around.
Yeah, I did see that graphic, and I was actually discussing this last night in another space, and I would just say that is a very misleading portrayal of the situation that is at hand. Turkey is not going to deploy the entirety of their navy into the Black Sea. Turkey has Black Sea coast, and they have a Mediterranean coast, within that specifically an Aegean coast. Turkey has significant strategic interests all along of its coastline. So no, you're not going to see the entirety of the Turkish Navy deployed into the Black Sea. And even if you did, again, Turkey does not have really any good capacity to deal with this problem posed by the K300P coastal batteries, which fire these Onyx missiles with a maximum range of 300 kilometers. Russia still has a very large air force. Russia still has surface combatants, which are quite potent. They have submarines. So, yeah, the Turkish Navy on paper is larger, but the Black Sea Fleet, what remains of it, is very much still a threat. And if, this is not going to happen, I am very confident of that. But even in a hypothetical scenario in which the entirety of the Turkish Navy sails out and tries to engage the Black Sea Fleet in decisive battle, the Turkish Navy would be sunk very quickly, in my opinion. So that's what I would say to that suggestion that the Turkish Navy has the upper hand here. I would say that Russia, even with the sinking of the Moskva and everything else, still has a very significant qualitative advantage in the Black Sea domain.
And for those who didn't catch it, I was setting that up as a softball, so thanks to Colby for disposing of it. Exit, go ahead.
So 2 things. To your point, Colby, commercial ships sail. That was Sal's point about the Iran-Iraq war. There was tons and tons, just like Google and look up the Wikipedia page of the number of ships that were targeted by missile attacks during the Iran-Iraq war that were transiting oil. The list is long. It shocked the ever-living heck out of me. And then I guess the only other thing I would like to ask and put out to the panel, because I actually have to step away for some family engagements, sorry. Is there any chance that Turkey offers to escort both Ukrainian and Russian ships in the Black Sea?
Does anybody think that would make a difference if Turkey felt that Russia needed protection of its commercial ships as well?
It's a very interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if Putin would go for that. That's very innovative thinking. I'll say that. But I don't know. It's a very interesting question to ponder. But I mean, just on the point about the tanker wars, and I totally get that there were a lot of ships that were making that perilous journey and came under fire. A handful were sunk. A pretty small fraction out of the total volume that we're going. So I would just say that if Russia really wants to shut this thing down, it's not going to take that many ships sitting at the bottom of the Black Sea, I think, for all the operators to decide it's not worth it, right? They can sink, a dozen of them. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see anybody being interested in continuing that if the Russians demonstrate that they intend to sink every single ship that's trying to make that journey.
I have to wonder if not Turkey makes that offer, but if China makes that offer, if the 43rd Naval Escort Group, which is on the west coast of Africa right now, swings through the Mediterranean, because who's the biggest recipient of Ukrainian grain but China? China's got a container ship stuck up in Odessa, has had it there since February of last year. What if they make the offer to be the nonpartisan arbitrator, and you see the Chinese Navy all of a sudden appear, because they have a huge interest in the Black Sea, not just in grain, but in the terminus of the overland railway that's coming in, that's moving cargo across the Black Sea. I think there are elements here that the economic impact of disrupting the grain trade coming out of Ukraine has unintended consequences that we can't even see yet. And to me, that's it's far-fetched, I know, but there's crazier things that we've seen happen before. But I think Turkey stepping in, it would be great for Erdogan to be able to be the arbitrator between Ukraine and Russia, but I don't see Russia taking it. If China came in and offered it, I'm not exactly sure that Putin can actually say no to Xi on that element.
Sorry, Mike glitched there. Colby, go ahead.
I'll just reiterate that the Bosphorus is closed right now to warships, so Turkey would have to agree to such a arrangement. And I feel very confident saying that Erdogan will not agree to Chinese warships coming into the Black Sea and doing those escorts. Turkey views China as a competitor in the emerging power vacuum in Central Asia. So I feel very confident that Turkey has no interest in letting China come into what Erdogan views as his domain and steal his thunder and, further expand Chinese influence westward. That's just not going to happen. Yeah.
I agree. I don't think Turkey is going to do it either, but if China requests it, that's going to be the interesting question, because then it makes Erdogan have to say no. And again, this is that element that starts being played out here with Chinese greater expansion, especially when it comes to their trade and ensuring that they're getting their element of grain out of Ukraine. Again, cutting off that grain, I think last time I looked at exits, it was about 7 million tons out of that. Almost 40 million tons went to China.
Well, if we're going to start talking about public request for transit, there are other NATO allies of Turkey who could request it publicly. Because my understanding is that those discussions may have been had, just not publicly like that. And that would feed into a whole nother set of considerations about, approval of Swedish accession, where some of the conditions for accession look like they're not slam dunks to happen. And, further kind of discord within NATO allies if you start talking about the request being made publicly. But Exit, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you to each of you who came to be part of the conversation about this tonight, because that was great and I really appreciated all your input. And I'm sorry that I have to go because this was amazing. But have an awesome evening and we'll see you all later.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. I think we all appreciate your dedication to the issue. And I think we're all expecting that there will be more machinations in the next couple of days. So hopefully you stay on the beat for a little while longer. And, just a reminder for the audience that we're talking through these issues, but there are so many interconnected issues, whether it be the NATO angle, domestic Turkish politics, connections to the countries of the global south. For example, Kenya just declared a food emergency the other day, and India came out and restricted the exports of rice. So there are so many angles at play. It's extremely difficult to know what's going to happen next. So really the best we can do is come together as a group like this and kind of bounce the ideas around. So thanks for joining the conversation on it. Yeah, go ahead, Exit.
I think that was Nigeria, not Kenya. And I like to correct you whenever possible in public because I never get to do it.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think it's in the nest, but we'll leave it be. Okay. So I don't see any other hands up on the Black Sea and the grain issues. So I'm going to move on to updates. Just as a reminder, because attendance has grown a little bit, you've seen a lively back and forth. We do invite contribution, from the audience, whether you have questions or comments. You can always request the microphone. It's the button in the bottom left-hand corner. And if you're enjoying the conversation, we'd like to get as many people in here chatting with us as possible. So consider retweeting the space. You can do that with the button in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. And if you're new here, we hold these conversations every Thursday night, starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and each Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, in an effort to be a little bit earlier and perhaps catch our European friends. Okay, so I will put some material up in the nest for updates. I know that, so the first issue I wanted to discuss is the attack on the Kerch Bridge. It actually, that attack happened just a few hours after our last conversation on Sunday. And so there have been several days, and I know there have been a half a dozen spaces that have already discussed it. So really, I'm just going to put these items up so that we are, set a baseline of essentially covering the news. But I am hoping for a little bit of input from the audience in terms of understanding how the blast likely occurred, which hopefully won't be too much of a rehash of what has been discussed in other spaces, and really to share some of the sources, because there have been a couple of interesting articles looking at the evolution of Ukrainian unmanned surface vessels. So if you have a look at the nest, these items should populate in just a moment. It seems like
Uh-oh. Did we lose you, Michael?
It sounds like we did for a second there. I know that we had also encouraged a number of people who are particularly interested in the developments with the Kerch Bridge to attend and contribute to the conversation, this particular conversation, if people are particularly interested in that subject and have questions for the panel or want to contribute in some way, please do request the mic, and we'd be happy to bring you up. As Michael pointed out, this has been discussed in a number of spaces, but there are aspects of it that have been overlooked, appreciated in the conversation, and so we're just looking to open that conversation a little bit.
I know. I personally am really interested in the water drones. There's Michael's back. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. That was had to reset the mic there. So when it freezes, I'm never sure if you catch the last 30 seconds, the last 10 seconds. But I was just saying that I know there's been a lot of discussion about the attack on the bridge already. We'll try not to rehash it too much. Really, it's more just to cover a baseline, hopefully get into what sorts of drones, or I think the general understanding is that it was likely drones that carried out the attack, but what kind they are. And so I wanted to start with the fact that there just really isn't a lot of video of this strike. And so I'm putting up in the nest this last item, which should populate in just a moment. So hopefully when it comes up, it's a tweet by Rob Lee. In contrast with the previous attack on the Kerch Bridge, where we immediately had dash cams from, I think, at least two different vehicles. There were, security footage of the suspect truck being loaded. Some of the footage, people were focusing on like ripples in the water beneath the bridge. So there were several different angles on it. In this case, despite it being fairly heavily trafficked, I haven't seen, and please correct me if you guys have seen this, I just have not. I haven't seen any videos that actually show near the point of detonation from a dash cam or security cam. So that first item in the nest, which is the tweet by Rob Lee, includes several videos from dash cams, but they all seem to be quite a ways off in the distance. And I don't know if this is just luck of the draw, or if this is because the Russians are maintaining more information discipline. And I'm not sure what's the case. But Kitty, you may know.
I wish I did know, but no, I was going to just note that the footage that we got, the security footage that we got of the October attack was pretty remarkable. And it's still curious to me how it even got out. It seemed like maybe somebody working in there had been taking it with their own cameras and shooting the screens. Excuse me. But I've been looking for it too and haven't seen anything.
Yeah, so it does seem like the closest we have are fairly distant dash cams. The second item in the nest is a rather distant sort of horizon shot that claims to be the explosion. Now, I know that there was another video going around of a strike that claimed to be on the bridge that was disproven, as actually showing an attack from back in May. I haven't seen any confirmation or disproof of this second video in the nest, but it really does seem like there isn't a lot of evidence. We'll go to Gurney and then to Jane. Go ahead, Gurney.
So I've been waiting to actually, well, first off, I don't really post, but I was waiting to see if anyone on Twitter, on the news cycle on Twitter here, had brought up the lack of video with the Kerch Bridge exactly to your question here. And I haven't seen it acknowledged. I do get that the news cycle moved on pretty quick from Kerch Bridge to different events here. But going back to the camera thing here, so one of the things that's readily apparent if you look at the videos and pictures of the bridge, and some of them have already been up in the nest. I don't know if I see them, but going back to the night of that, so what was that, Sunday or Monday, it appears that every second light post on both sides of the Kerch Bridge have surveillance cameras. It's pretty visible in the footage. It's something that if you're looking at it, you don't notice it at first, but then if you're looking for it, you see it. And not only are they on the light posts, every second light post in both directions, they're also under the roadway looking at the piers, and it looks like the spacing underneath looking at the piers is probably it's not the same distance, but it's enough distance that it basically covers looking at the base of each pier, each piling, etc. And I just want to contrast that. So why am I saying this? So when it came to the last attack on the Kerch Bridge, obviously through Russian information channels and assuming official Russian sources, we got that surveillance video, right? There was video showing underneath. It might not have been conclusive, but there was also video on the roadway, right? But both of those appear to have been from those official cameras. So again, why am I mentioning this, right? I'm mentioning it because, and maybe there's a hot mic here. Yeah. Okay. So the real reason I'm mentioning it is more the question of what it might tell us for why we haven't seen a release of videos. And again, I can't draw anything conclusive from it, but it's more interesting in terms of looking at it to say, why hasn't it been released? And if I just sort of game it out and think of some options as to why that video hasn't been released, what would be the benefit of not releasing it? One of the things that I come up with, and I'm sure others can help fill in some other ones here, but one of the most obvious answers potentially is that perhaps the video is not conclusive. And so you ask yourself, so why would you, if the video is not conclusive, why would you not release it? Well, you wouldn't release that because you might not want to tell your adversary, you might not want to tell Ukraine and the world, what sort of weaknesses that video coverage has, or that it's not conclusive, meaning you could still be looking for likely methods of how this was caused, et cetera. That's just one of the top ones I can think of. It doesn't mean that that's true. I just, I'm trying to think of why it hasn't been released, and there could be a million other reasons. But that's one of the interesting outcomes I can think of in terms of why it hasn't been released, because the alternate, if there is conclusive footage of this, sure, they could be holding back on it, but I just go to past pattern here, and they didn't hold back on it in terms of past video. More than that, they showed the truck. So I put that out there, food for thought, and to see if anyone else has thought about that or even noticed those cameras. You can see them in the pictures on the light poles, and you can see it below the road deck. As a matter of fact, I think one of the cameras looks like in one of the pictures it was destroyed underneath the roadway. But thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting question why they wouldn't release it. When you say it might be inconclusive or hint at their weakness, given there's a predominant narrative that it was likely a USB or several, perhaps they're just happy to run with that narrative because it's, I think if they could disprove it and say, haha, you guys have it wrong, it was different, they might come out and say that. But it's hard to draw firm conclusions from it. As I think about that, though, I'll go to Jane. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually very interesting about the cameras on the deck as well as below it. But just as I was on a site live when this news broke, and everyone was trying to figure out what the heck had happened. And I said, okay, I'm going to do something really out of the box. I'm going to check Google Maps and actually Google traffic and see if the traffic is backing up, because it wasn't even confirmed that it happened. And sure enough, Google traffic showed a huge traffic jam at the foot of the bridge. Obviously, no one was getting on from the direction that data was coming in. And a couple of hours later, everything cleared up magically, and there were no traffic jams. There was no traffic even being directed one way or another. It was just like a normal day. And I don't know if that was just something they did to reroute the traffic, or, I mean, it was interesting to find the traffic jam there because that sort of identified something had happened. And then the Russians came out and said, there's an emergency, blah, blah, blah. But it was sort of compelling to see the quantity of traffic that had backed up so quick. But an interesting source, and I don't know if it lends at all to Russia trying to control information coming out, but it just seemed rather curious to me that they managed to, the traffic that was just a large backup sort of evaporated and did so in an unreasonably, a very unnaturally quick time frame. So, just an interesting data point. But, yeah, this is a weird thing that there's nothing that is the actual video of the bridge hit, because I've got to believe there's enough cameras out there to show it if it happened. But you never know. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Continuing to run through updates with what we do have instead of just dwelling on what we don't have. The third item, back in the nest, it has a little clip of video. I picked this one because it shows more of the support columns, and people who have looked at it have suggested it doesn't seem like there is significant damage to the columns visible in the videos. Just recalling the way that damage analysis was done with the earlier attack, where people were looking for holes in the surface of the decking, that might indicate a missile, looking for scorching and the like. I haven't seen much indication in this case of discussion. Like, obviously there don't appear to be holes in the deck. We have good satellite imagery of the top. But I'm not seeing much analysis of scorching or visible damage to the underside either, and that may just again fall into the category of we just don't have enough imagery. But what has come out hasn't revealed very much from the column area. The fourth item back in the nest is really just so you can place it in space. It's between the island, I can't recall, I think it may be Tula Island, and the Russian side of the strait, which is a fairly narrow section. I noted to some people that the point where the attack took place is almost exactly on the international, territorial waters line between Russia and Ukraine, although I suspect that wouldn't, have been picked for symbolic purposes. I suspect this attack location was probably chosen for tactical reasons because of less attention in the area, greater likelihood of success. But it is interesting that it's right near that territorial line. The fifth item back in the nest goes to attribution. And so, again, anybody who's seen differently, please correct me. But I don't think that Ukraine has actually come out and claimed responsibility for the attack on the bridge. I think there have been statements along the lines of an attack on the bridge would be justified. It's a viable military target, but I don't think they've actually come out to say, yes, we were the ones who struck it. However, several articles have been published with anonymous sources, apparently stating that it was the Ukrainian security services, together with the Ukrainian Navy, who undertook the attack. So I partly say this just to highlight, I don't think it's official, but if anybody has seen any better source on that, please let me know. So I wanted to quickly get into an examination of what may have carried out the attack, what sorts of systems. So I don't know that we're going to solve it here in the space, but I just wanted to put the background material up for those who might not have come across this before. So the first item that should appear in the nest in just a moment is an article from Medusa, the Russian newspaper. Oh, actually, sorry, I didn't see the hand. Before going ahead, we'll go to Kitty.
There was, who is the woman in the Ukrainian on the Telegram? And she had put something out which actually claimed it. And I think that the translation was unclear, but then Stephen at Word translated it, and it was clearly her taking responsibility. I can find that if you like.
Yeah, that would. I know what you're referring to. It was a statement by Hannah Maliar about a week ago.
Yeah,
and we mentioned it in the space. She is a deputy minister of defense, and I think it was. I recall there was debate about whether she had said Ukraine struck the bridge, but that was in reference to the first attack on the bridge, and not. It was before this most recent attack, so I don't.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh,
as far as I know, because we talked about it about a week ago. But if you saw Hannah Maliar or anybody else specifically refer to this attack, then please let me know, because that would be interesting. So the first item in the nest is the article from Medusa that they try to break down what known Ukrainian systems could possibly have been used. And they go into a discussion about characteristics that Ukraine has released on some of the drones it's used in the past in terms of weight, payload, fuel capacity, and so on. And they discuss the distance to be traveled. And essentially, they're saying that there aren't many of the known Ukrainian systems that could have traveled all the way from, free Ukrainian territory and made it this distance carrying a warhead that would be thought to be sufficient to cause this level of damage. Their article is implying that it may actually have been a new system that we haven't seen before. But I'll pause. Go ahead, Museum.
Yeah, hi. There's a lot more to see, as you suggested earlier on, but one of the things that you spoke about, the mechanism for damaging the bridge, what I'm seeing is comparatively little collateral damage, if you like, but to me, it's as if the bridge has been lifted up and displaced all in one and then dropped and perhaps done further damage. And my hypothesis is at the minute is that the thing I can think of that best does the sudden increase in pressure without causing an awful lot of physical damage is some kind of thermobaric or fuel air munition. And I'm wondering whether that is in fact what's been done.
Well, that would be interesting. I put in the nest, it's probably about the sixth or seventh item back now, one longer distance video. You can always have a look at that and see if you think it could potentially be consistent with it. Anyway, beyond that, I think we're speculating. But if anybody sees more evidence on specifically what the system was.
Oh, yeah. Pure speculation, but it seems consistent with what I've seen so far.
That's fair enough. Yep. I will go to Kitty and then to Jane.
I just wanted to say you were quite right. It's embarrassingly so. Her quote was 273 days ago, we carried out the first strike on the Crimean Bridge to break Russian logistics. So pardon me. Yeah. Yep.
No worries. That's partly why I do this is I have a pretty good recollection of events. I'll just, because as co-host, we'll go to Jacoby and then to Jane.
Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to the post I put up in the front of the nest. Some stills showing cameras that Gurney and you were referring to on the bridge, and then in that same post, but underneath it, as a follow-up, is more of a close-up that shows the cameras, and then a camera underneath the bridge.
Thanks for that. And as we listen to Jane's comment, perhaps you guys might want to have a look at the third item in the nest, which is a tweet by H.I. Sutton that goes into the evolution of the known unmanned surface vessel systems operated by Ukraine, including the latest addition he's put on there, which is pretty clearly a modified jet ski. But go ahead, Jane.
The modified jet ski thing, very interesting, and I think a possibility, but museum, I just wanted to mention one thing. There was a structural engineer on the space when this was going on, and if you look at the decking in the aftermath, the way that it exploded, it almost cantilevered up a piece of the deck, a small amount. And, what that tells you about how things, how this went, from an explosives point of view, that's not a question I can answer, but that is something apparently that is a very important piece of the puzzle. But I have heard the jet ski issue, and apparently there is some good information to say it's something on that order.
If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the theory of the jet ski USVs, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one was pictured in the attack on the port at Sevastopol. I think just the day before, or maybe within the same 24 hours of the attack on the Kerch Bridge. So that's where people are getting the concept of that vehicle from. And so no jet ski vehicle, as far as I know, was imaged in connection with the bridge attack. But the speculation is it's the latest iteration of their experiments. And again, it was a fairly long distance shot, not at super high quality, but Sutton has tried to infer what he can about its likely characteristics. The fourth item back in the nest, we referred to briefly earlier when we were talking about, because this is all connected with the grain deal as well, but it was a great bit of OSINT work by M.T. Anderson to catch in the satellite imagery the wakes of 4 fast boats. And so because they were spotted near Snake Island, the expectation was, there had also recently been the story about Zelensky going out to Snake Island just in advance of the 500 days since the invasion, to film a video. And because it was in that region, I know I saw this post from Anderson when it came out, and I essentially dismissed it and said, okay, well, they're ferrying back to the island for some reason, or they're running a patrol. It didn't occur to me that this could be a whole group of drone ships making their way out. If that was the case, of course, that would be a longer sort of angle of approach than some nearer options, which would put even further constraints on their size and capacity. So again, M.T. Anderson does great work. I would encourage you to check out his account and consider giving him a follow. The further to that, this is more just for novelty. The fifth item back in the nest is the tweet by Captain Navy. And he talks about work that has been ongoing to coordinate the swarming effort of naval drones. And that's maybe an overlooked aspect. But seeing if, in fact, what was captured by MT Anderson in the satellite footage was 4 drones moving at the same time, then the dynamics of their control and whether they have any ability to interact in a swarming way, it would be an interesting question to learn more about. This video is, just training, and it's 6 years old. But if you can imagine what capacity would have improved, or how capacity would have improved in 6 years, you can imagine that they've made significant advances. And then let me see. Yep, 2 last items on the Kerch Bridge. The 6th item back in the nest is just to highlight that the Russians have decided to continue the traffic flow across the bridge in the one span that is only displaced by 3 or 4 feet. I've seen lots of people skeptical that this makes good sense from a structural perspective. My understanding is that they only permit 3 cars on it at a time. I suspect that they wanted to rush back to this state of affairs, to try to suggest that the attack wasn't a big deal to them. And they want people to stay in Crimea, and not be panicked and seeking to leave, because the only other alternative that was being proposed was that people try to cross the land bridge, through Mariupol, which obviously would be under pressure itself. And so I think they felt this was an important safety valve. At the same time, there was also video of trains crossing the train span. So it appears that there wasn't any damage done to that span that would impede traffic. Last item back in the nest, 7th item, it's by Bridget. And she has been following the AIS systems, which are the maritime sort of beacon or identification systems, rather like aircraft ADSB. And she's noted a significant drop-off in transmission of AIS signals. Her account about 2 months ago noted an area right at the Kerch Bridge where AIS signals suddenly dropped off. It was very regional, and it was believed that may have been because of some sort of a jamming system in an effort to protect against attack by aerial drones. Or I suppose jamming could also potentially interfere with naval drones. And it just looks like they may have switched it back on in full force. Jacoby, go ahead.
Just 2 things I want to emphasize or bring up is a question about the implications of what we're looking at here possibly could have happened on the bridge. Why it's valuable to look at the possibilities and open up the discussion to that. And also, you had mentioned that traffic had been opened up, car traffic, vehicular traffic had been opened up on the bridge, even just a few cars at a time, perhaps, and why they would take such pains to make that happen. And something I came across, I'm not exactly sure where, suggested that, there's an alternative way around a land bridge, as you described, that would route people past Mariupol, and that is not a desirable route as far as the Russian officials are concerned, because that would route traffic in a way that would emphasize the destruction of Mariupol and bring that into sharp relief for Russians who would be passing through it. And so there again, they want people to take this route. That was the suggestion of what the resource I'm referring to. Whether or not that's indeed the reasoning behind what they were, why they're trying so hard to route vehicular traffic back on the bridge or not. But it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, that is an interesting angle. I assume that routing all those people through the land bridge would present more logistical challenges in terms of gas consumption, road congestion, and the like. But I suppose that people seeing particularly if they're Russian holidayers, seeing the reality of the result of the war is a fair point. Okay. I wanted to move into discussion on little updates on the offensive. So the way I'll begin is just a reminder that because we hold our conversations just every 3 or 4 days, staying up to date on the minute changes along the front can be a challenge in this format. And so I tend to direct you guys, the listeners, to some of the better mappers who are doing it in much more detail than we can get into in the Twitter space format. So the first item up in the nest is a collection of some of the better maps that are done, and it's the usual suspects this week, including the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project Owl, GeoConfirmed, and others. And again, I encourage you guys to compare maps because people adopt different standards, so they may have slight differences in them, and occasionally one or the other will take a break. And a reminder that our friend, Andrew Perpetua, does walk through his map in a YouTube stream where he can share his screen, which is a much better format to do it than Twitter allows. And he holds those walkthroughs on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. and on Fridays at, I believe, 3 p.m. In an effort to be available for Europeans. So what I bring together is more items that I think I'll discuss the broad strokes, and then I try to find items that might otherwise be overlooked or that are good pieces of analysis. So it's more like a grab bag in connection with the offensive. So the second item in the nest, it's a tweet from BBC Ukraine, and yes, it's in Ukrainian. So if you want the details, you'll have to auto-translate it in your browser. But this was the interview where Ukrainian commander General Syrskyi came out and he reported that Bakhmut was nearly encircled, were the words that he used. And so Ukraine has been making great progress at pushing at the flanks around the city. On our last space, we heard reports from, again, Hannah Maliar, who's Deputy Minister of Defense. And at that time, they were saying that they essentially had the city under fire control. I don't know whether Syrskyi's words about being nearly encircled also refer to fire control or if there's some other meaning. But I wanted to present it to you because it sounds like there's significant progress being made there. The second item back in the nest is, the third item back is an item that was put up by Riverside Kitty. The fourth item back in the nest is with regard to the Russian push near Kupiansk. We mentioned this on Sunday that the Russians were apparently trying to distract from Ukrainian advances along the Zaporizhia front by attacking in the east. The latest update from Ms. Maliar was that now Ukraine had once again regained the initiative in the region. I had been hearing about some slow Russian progress on that front, but it sounds like the situation has been more stable in the last day or so. The fifth item back in the nest is linking out to a Financial Times article that is once again highlighting the theme that one of the most significant hurdles for Ukraine at the moment is the use of Russian mines. We've discussed this several times before, including some threads put up by the popular account Tatarigami, who got access to Russian manual for how to deploy mines, to funnel and trap and so on. And they're in material from our previous discussions. We also talked about potentially the use of Ukrainian forces in attempting controlled burns near minefields in an effort to destroy mines that way. But it really does seem to be one of the major problems facing Ukraine. And so they're making the point that more forces applied to areas that are mined do not result in faster progress. which is likely why we're still continuing to hear reports that Ukraine has not committed the bulk of its reserves, and that they're trying to make progress not only for attrition purposes, but also to defeat some of these battlefield pieces of engineering, so that when they do decide to commit their reserves, some of this difficult work has been accomplished. The sixth item back in the nest is it includes quote tweeted some video. There continue to be cross-border raids into the Russian Belgorod territories, and in this case, it was an ambush that was set up by an Ichkerian brigade, and so if you look through Caliber Obscure's work, he has 2 or 3 embedded tweets sort of in that chain, so you can get a little bit more background on that particular group that conducted the raids. The 7th item back in the nest, which is the last in this block, is a thread by Franz-Stefan Gady. And earlier I mentioned the new Russia contingency podcast episode, where the guests are Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee. And Mr. Gady was one of the experts who traveled to Ukraine with Kaufman and Lee. And I thought this thread was interesting. It reflects some criticism that has been levied at Ukraine periodically over the war, which includes that, a lot of the narrative that is discussed here on Twitter is that if Ukraine had been provided with more weapon systems, then they would have made significantly more progress. While that may arguably be true, Gady here is arguing that it's not necessarily a linear relationship between the amount of equipment provided and the rate of progress that Ukraine can accomplish. And he notes in particular challenges in carrying out combined arms that he thinks goes essentially to training and the difficulties of incorporating so many new forces at the same time, not only in terms of personnel, but also in terms of varied types of equipment and equipment that would have been, entirely unfamiliar or largely unfamiliar to the Ukrainians operating them. And so, I think that this mirrors some cautions that have been raised by Kaufman in the past, and it also reflects some comments by Konrad Muzyka, who I think is also an insightful analyst. And so I tend to think that there is probably something to these criticisms, which is not, to say it's any slow progress is entirely the Ukrainians' fault, but that it's entirely reasonable to expect these structural and training challenges to be hurdles for them, and that they remain issues as well, just as does limitations in availability of equipment. Okay. So in the absence of hands, I will just keep going. A couple more in sort of the grab bag of updates, but I see Patrick wants to weigh in, so we'll go to Patrick.
Thanks, Michael. I was looking at that same thread from Mr. Gady. I don't know if you saw it. The Drive, their Warzone section, had a more in-depth interview with him and asked him to expound on some of the points he makes in that. I believe it's a 16-point thread he did. And his assessment was that the Ukrainian Senior Officer Corps is still in something of a Russian mindset, and they're just not good at combined arms. They don't fully understand what they're using yet. They don't understand how to deploy it en masse, whereas the junior officers and the NCOs who have been doing this at either the platoon or the company or sometimes even the battalion level, they're actually quite good. But his assessment was, in addition to some equipment issues, and he does make the point that this is not a monocausal, as he calls it, a single cause issue, simply equipment. His assessment is that it's Ukrainian senior leadership just doesn't understand how to do this. And his his point I thought was well taken, because he says, basically only the United States knows how to do this on the scale that they're looking at for this counteroffensive. And, they're having to learn everything on the fly. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it's costly for them. And there are starting to be some issues with personnel, because now they're having to draft older people. And these are all, kind of coming to a head in their first major offensive operation. And he also said the obvious thing, as I recall. He basically said, look, they're going face first into fixed fortifications. That was always going to be ugly. And I really do think that article is worth a read, because it gives him an opportunity to expound on some of the things he was saying in that thread, which in and of itself I thought was quite good.
Well, I'm glad it caught your attention as well. I didn't see that interview in Warzone, so if I have a moment, I'll look for it, or if anybody else who's a speaker happens to see it, feel free to add it to the nest. Okay, in terms of, again, it's kind of the grab bag with regard to the offensive, I just wanted to highlight that Ukraine is continuing to engage in a process of deep strikes. When we had Mr. Kaufman speaking with us, I asked him about, strikes on ammo depots, and he had highlighted, well, not every concentration of equipment is an ammo depot, but these first items in the nest really do seem like an ammo depot, very linearly laid out with berms and so on, that was struck by Ukraine just yesterday, and that it is fairly far behind the front lines, which is partly what caught people's attention, likely to be a candidate for strike by either Storm Shadow or potentially some sort of on-the-ground forces. So the first item in the nest is by D. Mojavensis, who does lots of good OSINT work, and he caught it on firms, as did a handful of others. The second item in the nest is some battle damage assessment by Brady Afric. He's got a little GIF going, so you can see that something like, it looks like 2/3 of the sort of bermed areas, which the berms are built up to prevent sort of sympathetic detonations, or one detonation causing others. And you can see that they appear to be effective because 2 different areas were damaged, but that quite a lot of it was affected. Interestingly, I don't think I got to it at the beginning of the space. There were some claims that came out in connection with this attack that were published by the Kiev Independent, and they said that Budanov had made some statements about Ukraine carrying out the strike. And interestingly, the Kiev Independent then came out and made a retraction, which is not something I'd seen them do before. And they explained that, in fact, the statement they were attributing to Budanov was put out on Telegram by an account that, Budanov did not make the statements. It was not an official account, but they picked it up and ran with it as if it were official. And obviously, the government must have reached out to them. And it caught my attention that they were particularly concerned about it in this case. And I don't know if it was the misattribution to Budanov, or just as a general reminder not to take, even the Kiev Independent, not to take for granted what is seen on Telegram. Following which the Ukrainian General Staff then put out, hey, here are our official channels. Don't believe everything that you hear. And besides potentially just using it as an example, it made me wonder whether this, there were some characteristics of this strike that made Ukraine particularly sensitive to disinformation on it. But I haven't come to any conclusion. So I'm really just raising it as an interesting point that might inspire you guys to go away and do a little bit more digging. The fourth item back in the nest, I'll occasionally put up Nalcio's updates on losses of equipment for both Ukraine and Russia, just in connection with the offensive. But in this case, the tweet by Jeff, who is a close observer as well, is a breakdown of Russian artillery systems by model, in that the other summaries like Binalcio and others lump artillery systems together. But if you want a little bit more detail laid out for you without having to, count it by date on Oryx's site, there it is for you. And you can see that the rate of Russian artillery loss seems like it has definitely picked up and is shockingly high at the moment, which is great news for Ukraine. In terms of Russian potential to continue, maintain its defenses, a law was recently passed. So this is the fifth item back in the nest that extended the reserve period for reserve troops to a mandatory 5 years, and also adjusted the ages that were permissible for soldiers to begin work in the reserves from 50 to 55 years old. So again, this is them, trying to broaden their pool of reserves, probably because they're under a fair bit of stress in terms of available manpower. The sixth item back in the nest, and again, this is a bit of a grab bag, is a link to an essay that was written by Dara Massicott and carried in the New York Times, just about Russia's compounding errors and how a lot of these mistakes on the battlefield that are not being corrected, these bad choices are slowly adding up and really do have a corrosive effect on Russia's ability to maintain its fighting capacity. Okay, I'll put up one more short block of materials in connection with the offensive that caught my attention. Then I'll move on to some updates on Wagner, and that will probably be the last of the material that we will cover tonight. So we'll probably run for about another half an hour. Sorry, I'm just getting these items put up in the nest. The first of which is a link to the Washington Post, who confirm from Ukrainian sources that for the first time they have begun using the U.S. supplied cluster munitions. I just see the hand, so I'll pause and we'll go to Jacoby.
Sorry, I just wanted to refer back to the Warzone post that Patrick was referring to. I put that up in the nest. It's also in the replies for anybody who's interested in checking that post out. It's there for you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, no problem. Thanks. So the first item up there, as I mentioned, the Washington Post article confirming the first use of cluster munitions from the United States in Ukraine. The second item back includes a video of their use. Many of you have probably seen this. It went around. It was fairly popular in the quote tweet of OSINT Technical. But an interesting detail that was only picked up in some of the reporting is that apparently in this very specific strike, a semi-notable Russian soldier was killed who he ran a Telegram channel called Misha in the Donbass that had 25,000 followers or something like that. So it's interesting to be able to connect a specific strike with the loss of, sort of somebody with a bit of a profile on social media. The third item back in the nest is, again, this one's kind of amusing. I actually saw this claim go around, and I didn't know what to make of it when I first saw it. The claim is that Russia had produced 200,000 Lancet drones. And, there's debate over how accurate the Lancets are, but, even if it's not a particularly high percentage of Lancets that strike, of the strikes that do occur, a fair number of them are Lancets. So they can be effective. And 200,000 is an awful lot of drones, but, I was immediately skeptical that they could produce that many of that type. So this tweet, the third back, is by Fane Greenwood, who's a friend of ours, who follows drones closely. And what she figured out is that apparently it was a Russian Telegram channel that was trying to make a bit of a joke and paraphrase a line from Star Wars about having 200,000 units available, and that through sort of a game of telephone that was picked up as an assertion that Russia had literally produced 200,000 Lancets, and then was repeated. So in case you saw that number go around, that was an error in translation. The fourth item back and last in this block. Actually, sorry, I did speak to this earlier. This is in Ukrainian, but if you translate it, this was the Defense Intelligence account highlighting not to believe all sources. And if you were to click through to their website, they list all of their official media channels. And this was in connection with the Kiev Independent article that cited a fake quote from Budanov. So if you want to see those official channels, there you have it. Okay. I will put up some material with connection with Wagner. If I count ahead, I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks. Yep, 4 blocks on Wagner, and then we'll probably call it for the evening. So the first item that will pop up in the nest in just a minute was a claim that was put out on one of the official Wagner channels that broke down Wagner casualties in Bakhmut. And they, again, you can't necessarily take for granted as true all of their claims, but their claims of losses were shockingly high considering it was coming from them. You have to take it in the context of perhaps them wanting to portray their losses as being high, to talk about their heroic sacrifices now that they're not aligned in interest with the Kremlin anymore. But specifically, they said that in the battle for Bakhmut, Wagner had 78,000 total fighters, of which 22,000 were killed and 40,000 were injured, which is a hugely high number of casualties. So it's interesting that they would come out and make that claim. The second item back in the nest is they also came out and made an announcement that it was their intention to release all of the convicts who had fought with Wagner, saying that many of them are right now waiting in hotels away from the front, only for their pardons to arrive. So, there was some doubt about the Russian Ministry of Defense's ability to convert many of the Wagner fighters into contract positions. And if Wagner is to be believed, the suggestion is that many of them are not signing contracts and waiting for their pardons. Whether the Russian government goes a step further and, requires them to fill out a period of contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, or else they will not be pardoned, we'll have to see how that develops. The third item, Wagner came out and made the announcement that they would be closing down their training base at Molkino, which had been it's in the Krasnodar region, and it had been their primary base throughout the war. So, that shows a significant shift away from Russian operations. And in the next block, we'll get into increasing evidence of fair numbers of Wagner fighters apparently heading to the new camp in Belarus. So it seems like, that transition is actually taking place, and they're really cutting down their ties in Russia. The fourth item back, and again, it's a claim from Wagner, so you don't take it as necessarily definitive, that it's one of the well-known fighters who goes by the name Zombie, who apparently came out and made a statement, which is being interpreted as an effort to assert that much of the Wagner forces are not opting to subordinate themselves to the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the link to that statement on Telegram is included in that tweet if you'd like to see the original. The fifth item back, we had talked about how after the Wagner revolt, there was an assertion that the Russian National Guard would be permitted heavy equipment, use of tanks and the like, which would be a fair change in their capabilities. And the Russian Duma actually just passed the law that enables that. So if you'd like more detail, check out the Medusa article that's fifth back in the nest. Okay, I'll put up the next block. Some of which, so that point about many Wagner fighters not subordinating themselves to the Russian Ministry of Defense is interesting, and there's a bit of an expansion on it in this next point. Let's see here. But we're going to begin with some visual confirmation that Wagner fighters are making the transition to the base in Belarus. Several of the good OSINT analyst accounts had a look at this, including the Belarusian Hadrian Project. I've put up the a version of some updated satellite imagery from Konrad Muzyka. I think some of the accounts actually had made a GIF showing the change on the ground of the camp, which was, in satellite imagery was just the tents, to in the last few days, you'll see that there are now plenty of trucks and you can see some individuals in the camp. So it looks like it's now starting to become populated. But that's just by way of, visual confirmation. You can find it from several accounts. The second item back in the nest goes to, at the camp, there was a combined a joint speech done by Prigozhin and one of his right-hand men, Dmitry Utkin. And Prigozhin in that speech made several important points, including the idea that Wagner was through with Ukraine and that they must prepare for Africa. But the reason that I've put up Rob Lee's tweet as the second item there is his assertion that Utkin, who almost never appears on video, was likely included in this one intentionally as a sign of unity in some of Wagner's, senior lieutenants remaining loyal to Prigozhin. If they felt that that was necessary, it suggests that there may be dissension in other ways, and they felt there was some weakness that had to be counterbalanced, which is an interesting insight. But in connection with that idea, the third item back in the nest is a tweet by Jack Margolin, and in that, he highlights a set of claims that have come out now that a Wagner member named Andrei Troshev may actually have defected along with a number of Wagner fighters to the Russian MOD. So, I know I'm putting these up as individual data points, but you can start to put them together to see that Wagner account Zombie making a statement that Wagner is not subordinating itself to the MOD, then Prigozhin having a joint speech with Utkin, who almost never appears on camera, in an apparent sign of unity, gives a little bit more credence to the idea that Troshev and some others may have defected. And I put the, defection with air quotes, because obviously that's the path that the Kremlin wanted them to take. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about Troshev, do read Jack Margolin's thread. I can't get in, or I'm not going to take the time to get into all the detail now. But he does explain that Troshev essentially was, a fairly respected, but an administrator who mainly worked in logistics and doesn't have the same degree of loyalty that some frontline commanders within Wagner would merit. And so, Margolin is trying to put context around how significant Troshev's move to the MOD would be, suggesting that he may not have taken a huge number of Wagner fighters along with him. The fourth item back in the nest, which I think is the last in this block. No, one more. So the fourth item back, you'll see is a video statement from a Ukrainian general, just talking about their preparations for the risks presented by Wagner in Belarus, where it's consistent with what we've been hearing for the last week or so, which is they understand that it may create conditions along the border. It may increase the risk, but that Ukraine has been hard at work to improve defenses along the Belarusian border so that it's completely impassable. Saying things like there's more than 40 kilometers of anti-tank ditches and lots of other mines and other preparations to reassure those who may be worried about Wagner's presence in Belarus. Likewise, the fifth item back in the nest, we had already talked about how Poland has also been a little bit more concerned with Wagner's presence and have moved some forces further to the east, closer to the border, just to be more prepared. And this fifth item back, where Reuters wrote about it, I couldn't promptly find the original Reuters article. I try to go right to the source where I can. But this wire service is quite good. And apparently Peskov, in response to the movement of Polish troops closer to the border, had said that the decision by Poland to bolster its border is a cause for concern, and that the Kremlin is calling on Poland, the Kremlin is calling Poland's actions aggressive and saying that its hostile attitude may require heightened attention. So I included that just because of the flip of the rational position, which is that it is Russia that's creating increasing tensions by moving Wagner into Belarus, and that the Polish response is the rational one. So the Russians using
Oops. Do you need a little reset, Michael? Yeah, okay. I'll be right back. Let's see.
While we wait for Michael to come back, I will just direct people to the replies. All of the items that we put in the nest are in the replies, and as everybody is usually aware who frequents this space, and just to direct people who might not be aware of our space, Michael in particular uses the nest quite a bit, which is the information at the top of the space. You'll see a number of dots there that you can swipe side to side, and you'll see all the resources that we've been sharing up there, and then moving down to the replies, which are found in the lower by hitting the button in the lower right hand corner of the space. For some people it's purple, for others it's black, and that's where you can also interact with the space in replies too. And I think Michael's back.
I am sorry about that. It's always frustrating when it freezes up for a few seconds. So we only have 2 little blocks left in what we're going to have time to finish tonight on Wagner. Please bear with me while I get the last of the material up in the nest. As usual, I'll draw your attention to the fact that there is material we're not going to get to, including on new Ukrainian military equipment, like the new U.S. aid that was announced just yesterday, $1.3 billion, or the fact that just earlier tonight, just before this space began, apparently the Pentagon spokesman in an interview with Fox News said that Ukraine would receive F-16 jets by the end of the year. So I'll just so you at least have the source on that one. I'll put that up in the nest in a moment. But there were also lots of interesting developments in the humanitarian front and in the diplomatic front. So I would encourage you, do click on that tweet that is the farthest right in the nest, the invitation to the space, and in that thread you'll find all the source material that we won't have time to cover tonight. So in this next block, I wanted to talk about developments in connection with Wagner in Africa. And so this is a bit of a follow-up to the presentation that we had on Sunday when Casus Belli, who does lots of research into Wagner activities, particularly in Mali, came to chat with us. So if you have a look at the first item back in the nest, or actually, sorry, the first item may not have populated yet, but it's will in a moment, and it's a link to a Reuters article. Yep, it's there now. A link to a Reuters article that is a write-up of the comments that Prigozhin made in that video with Utkin I referred to, where they said, no more fighting in Ukraine, let's prepare for Africa. Further to that, the second item in the nest is a tweet from Casus Belli, who noted that just the other day, on Monday, Wagner came out with a new recruiting campaign in Africa, saying that Wagner offers its services to ensure the sovereignty of African states and to protect African populations against militants and terrorists. So the fact that they're continuing to recruit suggests they intend to be there for the long haul. The third item in the nest, again from Casus Belli, is a statement from Alexander Ivanov, who talked about the ongoing rotation of mercenaries in the Central African Republic. For the last week or two, in our spaces, I've mentioned reports of these movements where right after the Wagner revolt, some were suggesting it was a withdrawal of Wagner forces, when others instead chimed in and said, no, it's connected with seasonal rotations as the rainy season comes in. And this is further confirmation from Wagner-affiliated group saying, yeah, there are lots of Wagner forces coming in as well, so it's a rotation. Interestingly, since we were talking about the idea of subordination to the Russian Ministry of Defense, in these Africa-centric statements, he also pointed out that the new mercenaries who are arriving do not have contracts with the Russian MOD. So that one caught my attention as well. The fourth item back in the nest is a breakdown in the Moscow Times of the idea that the relationships that Wagner has built up over many years with local officials in Africa contribute a lot to its value, and that can't merely if those commanders were all changed out in order to replace them with commanders who were more loyal to the Kremlin, a lot of that value would be lost. So this analysis talks about how it's ultimately more like a slow seizure of assets than it is simply a change in command. So you can see more detail in the Moscow Times article. Kitty, did you want to go ahead?
Do we have any idea how many Wagnerites have signed up to work under the MOD?
I don't know. I don't know that there's any scope to figure that out from open sources. I haven't seen the Russian Ministry of Defense make any claims. So the closest I've seen on that front are these competing claims that I'm highlighting tonight, as between Utkin and Zombie and others talking about most of the fighters are not making a transition, with the reports of Troshev and others in the Jack Margolin tweet, who are reported to have signed up or split off, but I haven't seen any numbers attached from either of those sides. Jane, your hand was up and then down. Did you want to add something in?
Yeah, no, the only thing I was going to say is I can't imagine a whole lot of the folks that were in with, Wagner fighters would sign up for MOD contracts. It allows the MOD too much ability to just spread them out and reduce any of Wagner, even their individual effect. They can be their impact can be decreased to almost nothing. And besides the type of individuals they had within their ranks, either special forces all the way across to prisoners, it just does not necessarily fit the, I don't know, it just does not strike me that they will have a great number of Wagner troops signing MOD contracts. I can't see that being the case, and I haven't seen any information to say otherwise in open source. But curious to know if anybody has any thoughts on that beyond this.
Well, the idea that so Kitty's question and then Jane's comment. That assertion from Wagner that it's releasing most of its convicts, without any sign of corresponding action from the Russian MOD in order to try to secure the loyalty of those convicts, suggests that it seems like a lot of the professional force of Wagner is staying loyal and apparently moving to Belarus. That's the indication now. If we're seeing Prigozhin there, we're seeing Ukhin there, and they're talking about we need to prepare for Africa. It seems like they've got a gig training the Belarusian military that they're going to run with for a while. How they cycle back and forth to Africa, or whether they move their base of operations to Africa, all of which remains to be seen. But the idea that most of the professional force is going to Belarus ultimately for work in Africa, some small element of the professional force has split off and gone to the MOD. And then a lot of the convict force is due to be released. That seems to be how it's shaking out. But again, no numbers on any of that. Kitty, go ahead.
Well, just in mentioning Belarus, I've seen a lot of sort of like uprisings against Lukashenko. I don't know what's going on with that. Any comment on that?
So I'm sorry, I missed that.
I've seen a lot of sort of random Twitter, I don't know, yelling at whatever Lukashenko and just saying, he's got to go. I don't know. Is there actually something rumbling about him?
I haven't heard anything recently about there being a particular risk to Lukashenko beyond the sort of background noise. We did hear, and I reported on the other day, the fact that the Belarusian Ministry of Defense had set out a roadmap with Wagner for training purposes. And so, that suggests that they're happy to try to harness them, in a symbiotic way. Which doesn't mean that Lukashenko is safe from any potential risk, but it does seem like they are trying to work together. I don't have the source for this, but I did see one report, unconfirmed, that there was a brawl between some Wagner fighters and some Belarusian soldiers the other day, where ultimately the Belarusian soldiers backed off and sort of yielded to the Wagner fighters. I can't even recall which account posted it. So, if I could find it quickly, I'd put it up, but I probably cannot. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any risk to Lukashenko.
One thing that had come up with the a lot of Ukrainian kids that were in Belarus.
Oh yeah, well that's a bit of a different issue, and maybe the way I'll do it is use that as a transition to note. If you have a look in the nest, I put up some some materials. First, a plug. The first item in the nest is the invite for our next discussion, which is going to be on Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can always set your reminder through that invite there. The second item back is a link to the second half of the agenda. Now, what Kitty's referring to is risk to Lukashenko potentially in the kidnapping of children from Ukraine. And you are correct. There have been several recent reports on that front, including one Belarusian, essentially NGO in exile that filed a report requesting that charges be filed by the International Criminal Court against Lukashenko. And so I had one block dedicated just to the issue of the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, in which just yesterday, the European Parliament voted to recommend to the ICC to pursue charges against Belarusian officials. So it seems like that issue is being moved ahead by other groups as well. And there are a bunch of varied materials about Ukrainian children in that item that's now in the front of the nest. But that's a different kind of risk than the Wagner-related risk. Is that what you were referring to, Kitty?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, because it's nice to have an excuse to get that in. So let's see here. Okay, yeah. The last item I wanted to raise, I won't go into detail because it might be a little bit slow for the end of the space, but if you have a look, it's the fifth item back. This was my last block on Wagner, and it's in connection with a whole bunch of new sanctions that have been filed in the last 2 days. I won't go through every item in here in detail, but I will just highlight that new sanctions were applied by the United States, by the UK. If you wanted to have a look in that block, there's a tweet from Eric Toller that breaks down who some of the sanctioned individuals are, what their role is within Wagner. If you have a look, the fourth item in that talks about some better sanctions targets. So Jack Margolin tweeted about how it appears that the people who are chosen to be sanctioned tend to be administrative folks who are not sort of frontline leadership. And he suggests that those who are overlooked should not be, and they should be sanctioned as well. So I thought that was an interesting insight. And then if you wanted to see all of the sanctions that are currently applicable to Wagner and Wagner-related people, there is this tool from the Atlantic Council that is their, what is it called? Their global sanctions dashboard, which is a really cool tool. So in that way, you can see what sanctions are applicable to Wagner. So I do aim to run about 3 hours, so we're just over that, but I think I will wrap up here. And there is, again, I had put, it's now the third item back in the nest, but if you wanted to see a bunch of the material we didn't get to, it's that second half of the agenda that goes to Ukrainian equipment, economic matters, diplomatic matters. So do have a look there. I put a bunch of time into preparing it, and I always am a little sad when we don't get to it. With that, I think that I will just say, thank you to everybody who came to listen tonight. Thank you to all of our speakers. We had a great dynamic back and forth, largely led by Exit on developments in the Black Sea and with grain exports, but we had lots of contributors. I would encourage you to check out the profiles of our speakers. I think almost all of them have been following the war in detail since the beginning, and have a look at their profiles, consider giving them a follow. And then I guess finally, I will also mention that we did have an update on that new Sudan OSINT initiative. We had Mustafa come and chat with us. And that's, if you look in the good examples, I believe it was the good examples section of the agenda. It has the invitation to their new capacity building initiative for a new Sudan OSINT project. So if that interests you, check it out. And then finally, I'll say thank you to my co-hosts, to Kitty and to Jacoby. without your help, it would be very hard to run these spaces. And so with that, I'll say that I hope you can join us in our conversation on Sunday. And otherwise, have a great night.